Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me along today. It's very nice to say we're doing innovative stuff. I always look at other museums and I think, oh, they're doing such exciting stuff as well. And I'm sure all of you out there are. What we're doing and what I'm going to share to you today is quite specific in some ways to us, because we're to do with the Paralympics. Couldn't be more appropriate with the Paralympics going on at the moment. But, you know, I'll really welcome your questions at the end and, you know, look forward to hearing those. I'm just going to share the screen on here. So can you all see that? All right.
Yes, I can see it.
Yep, brilliant. Okay then. So my name's Vicky Hope Walker, and I've got a big title because we're only a tiny museum. My title is the CEO of the National Paralympic Heritage Trust, but we're only a tiny team, so there's only 4 of us. And that's dealing with everything from the small museum, from regional outreach, from projects and digital content, and also, most importantly, and what this talk is kind of focused on, the collections development work and one specific project. The picture you can see here with the flag on it saying Stoke Mandeville Games, that's or SMG. That's an early picture of what the Paralympics were previously called, the Stoke Mandeville Games, because they began here in Stoke Mandeville, just on the outskirts, just south of Aylesbury. And they began with a competition in 1948, the first international games in 1952, and then the first games overseas in Rome in 1960. So very relative new history. So I'm going to be talking to you specifically about a project. It is a project that has many facets to it, but one of them, the key components of it, is about the recording and co-curation of our collection, and the sharing of that co-curation at a later date. We haven't got to that point yet. And it was actually, we applied for the funding back in 2019, but with COVID and everything else going on, we've only really kicked off the project in the last year, doing as much as we can online before we could actually get together and do some of the in-person meeting and the work that we needed to get on with. So a little bit about us, the Paralympic Heritage Trust, and who we are. We were set up in 2015, so we're very new, and you may or may not know that when the government bid for the London 2012 Games, within that bid was an Olympic and Paralympic museum to be built in the Olympic Park in London. Well, that never happened. And the Olympic side went absolutely nowhere. The Paralympic side brought me on as a consultant because I'd previously worked in the across the arts and museums and with Paralympians. And we brought together a business plan and established ourselves as a charity and a company. So we're very, very new. And our motto here is we exist to enlighten and inspire future generations by celebrating, cherishing and bringing the Paralympic heritage and its stories of human endeavour to life. That came out of quite a lot of research across the sector and what people felt was important in terms of the work and what we should be doing. But why is Paralympic heritage of importance? Well, firstly, it tells the story of a bridge between sport and the fight for disability rights, so really important, and of the individual struggles of many different disability groups, and how they developed sport and playing and enjoying sport, both at a grassroots level and at an international level. It's also a history of social inclusion and opportunity, And it's also a history which is very good and is at the heart of our values of how we can challenge negative perceptions towards disability. And you might think, well, since 2012, it was a really positive experience. Why would you need to do that? Actually, hate crime has increased 100% in children, 50% with adults towards people with disability since 2012. Now, whilst some of that is possibly a positive, i.e. people are more confident to report hate crime, a lot of it is still a negative, and was probably the result of a lot of media and negative media following and through the changes to the welfare cuts to people with disabilities in 2017. So, and there is inequality still between the Olympics and the Paralympics. So, you know, that journey has not been an easy one to this point. It's been 2 steps forward and 2 backwards for the last 70 years, really, and we're not quite there yet. This picture is polo, only polo being played with a puck and some croquet sticks in the hospital by some veterans. So the importance of the collection's development to ourselves, I've already mentioned we're a new organisation and it's a new heritage collection. And I guess that placed us in a relatively advantageous position of we could think about immediately what the voice was that we wanted behind that collection. And because this is a collection that relates to disability, it was really important to us to have a voice that spoke for disability. And also because it's a relatively new collection and a new history, there were still a lot of people around who'd been involved as volunteers, as athletes, as coaches, as administrators from the very early games. So the whole thing of getting the story directly from them and oral histories has been a very important part of what we've done. The other thing I've got up there, access and inclusion. This goes back to the fact, as I've already mentioned, our collections are disability based and we needed that voice and leadership from people with disabilities. Finally on there, I've got vulnerable collections. Quite a lot of the items we have are sometimes, for example, the costumes from London 2012, we've got 70 from the opening ceremony. Some of those were made just for one night's performance. And so a lot of them are plastic. They're not going to last very long. So we were thinking about, well, what can we do? Yes, you can photograph them, you can get some good photographs of them, but what can we do to make sure we preserve them longer and people can use those in terms of research and access? And the idea of 3D photography and recording these items in 360 degrees, where you could actually focus in on how they were made and the textures and things like that came into mind, and we devised the project that would enable us to bring in people with disabilities to record, to train and record items from our collection in 3D. There's numerous pictures here of the early games, and you can see actually there's also one in colour here. It's of sort of a couple in colour of desks. This is actually a doctor, a consultant's office in the hospital just a couple of years ago, with all sorts of items that we've been taking out of the hospital as well. So we're still uncovering a lot of collections almost on a daily basis. You know, we'll get a call or someone says, oh, I found this, do you want it? And we're based near the hospital where Dr. Gutman's behind me, and he was the German Jewish refugee who escaped to this country in the 1930s and was invited by the government to set up the world's first specialist spinal centre to treat patients. And it was his rehabilitation programme, introducing sport as part of that programme, that led on to the Paralympic Games. And right from the start, he was talking about, I want an Olympics for the disabled. Back in the 40s, he was saying this. So a very, very go-ahead man of his time and a very inspirational man. So the project that we set up was called Digital Explorations, and it's been funded by the Rothschild Foundation, the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and then a little local fund called Thriving Communities. And the kind of context, the aims of it is for us to create a co-curated virtual gallery on the history of the Paralympics in 20 objects. And we're probably going to focus on the early history because that's where we want to capture stories, particularly where people are getting very elderly. Objects might be rarer and more delicate. And it's the idea of the virtual gallery. We were doing virtual stuff before COVID because we're only a tiny museum. People may not come and visit us from very far away. We're only 54 square meters. And so virtual access was really important to us already. And virtual access was really important in terms of people with autism and being able to prepare for a visit, or actually finding a visit too much, so being able to do a virtual one. So the idea is to investigate and record in 3D photography up to 50 objects from our collections, working with and training members of our local community who have disabilities, and to broaden the interpretation of our collections, bringing in the voice of disabled people. And finally, to increase and diversify access to the collections, and having a virtual gallery, having 3D objects which bring in audiences of a different ilk quite often. And there's been some really interesting research on when you manipulate a 3D object online, it stimulates the same areas of your brain as if you are actually physically holding that object. So there's a really good argument for 3D photography to engage people in a different way rather than just through ordinary film or images on there. So the process that we go through for this is we've been running it in cohorts. We're actually in our second cohort at the moment. We're about to, this autumn, go into recruiting our third cohort of participants. And as you can imagine, because of the nature of our collections, when we developed the Heritage Centre, the little museum here, we actually consulted very widely with disabled people. We had a team of 10 people with disabilities, varying disabilities, sit on our design panel right from the word go, before anything was on paper, and all the way through. And then we also consulted with over 1,500 people with disabilities in the area in which we are based. So we have developed pretty good partnerships with all sorts of organisations, from Autism Bucks to partnerships with Shape to Bucks Vision, you name it, the groups out there, brain injury charities, we've built relationships with them. So when we set up this whole project, we talked to them about it at the very start, and then they have helped us in that recruitment process. We then, because of COVID, actually did a lot of this online. The introduction to the project, what it was about, what the commitment meant for people. And then we've kind of had new numerous presentations of things that are on the list here, which I will run through as well. I think what's really important about this project is it's not only just bringing these people in to train them in the 3D photography, but also to train them in areas of understanding what archives and collections are about, understanding what our collection's about, aspects of curation and writing, interpretation. We also introduced a workshop on sports journalism. You know, how do you engage people? Another angle on it. Also, they have a presentation from a Paralympian, the point of view of the athlete, where they're coming from, how they like their stories told, and all of that before the 3D scanning training. We're still doing the training at the moment, but once people are trained up, for those who want to, they will be paid to actually go in and also run some workshops with young people in SEND schools, special education needs schools. And those who don't want to do that, that's fine. They will just come in and we'll be paying them to do the scanning work. We'll be paying them £15 an hour to do that work. So there is a job opportunity in there, and in fact, a longer term opportunity, which I will tell you a little bit about later on. So we've, as I said, just started the scanning workshops. I'll show you an object a little bit later on of what they look like. I've just done a little video film of it turning rather than manipulating it on the screen, because to do that, I would have had to embed a different software into the PowerPoint presentation, and I wasn't that clever. So the part two, after all those presentations and workshops, most of which are in the region of 2 to 3 hours, we've been doing the scanning. The company we've brought in to do the scanning, it's quite interesting, there's not a lot of companies out there to do it unless you're commissioning somebody to do a 3D scan for you, which can be really, really expensive. We approached a jewellery and fine art commission company called Ersai. We had previously worked with them to reproduce the very first gold medal won in the Paralympics, and they are very skilled in that. It just so happened one of them happens to have a brother who's the captain of the British wheelchair rugby team, who of course have just got gold, which is absolutely amazing, especially considering their funding was withdrawn from Rio, so they've done it off their own back. So they were kind of perfect fit really for what we wanted to do. So they have started running the training. It's going on today, actually, in the next room. And then once they're trained, as I said, some of those will be able to go out and do some workshops and get some young people in SEND schools to also do some of the scanning for us and develop some skills themselves. The part 3, we are just embarking on that with a company called Fuzzy Duck in building the virtual gallery. And again, we're involving our participants in the scanning in that, you know, what should this gallery look like? How should you enter it? What should the entrance be like? How should we display things? So you will have these 3D objects that float in different areas that you can manipulate or focus in on, but you will also have the opportunity to watch the interpretation that has been created by our participants. And sometimes they might do that as an oral recording rather than a written piece as well. And then also in part 3, we're starting to look at companies who will sponsor this for us. And again, this comes on to some of the long-term benefits of this project, who are willing to, it could, for example, become the Panasonic gallery. Panasonic are a sponsor of the International Paralympic Games, and several of those companies have shown a bit of an interest. So we're working on that. And that obviously enables our reach to be much bigger than just nationally. And our collection, our early collection in particular, is of international importance because the games came from here and developed here, really all the way through to the International Paralympic Committee being set up in 1989. So again, really important for building those audiences. And finally, part 4, which wasn't part of our original application, but was a thought in there that we would look at developing, is we will have people trained up to do the 3D photography, to bring in a new viewpoint and being able to package and sell that service to other cultural organisations. Whereby we are paying the people that we have trained, but there is also some financial benefit back to ourselves. Because as you can imagine, being a new museum in the current climate is not easy. We have no core funding at all on doing all our funding apart from 5-year funding programme. So in a sense, that's our core funding for 5 years. But after 5 years, after 2022-23, we need to find a way of being financially viable. So the project outcomes, we will obviously have collections that are recorded in an alternative format. And as I mentioned earlier, a format which does stimulate the parts of the brain as if you're actually handling objects. And it's of interest to people, you know, where they can engage in a different way online, makes it more exciting and more interesting. We'll have access to our collections broadened, both in terms of having a gallery and also in terms, more importantly, of the co-curation of our collections by people with disabilities. We will have a trained and skilled group of freelancers. We'll have a virtual gallery that will hopefully bring in international interest. We would have developed some commercial sponsorship that will give us funding for another year or two. And we will have created this new service that other cultural organisations can buy into, and it will provide a service which is skilled, you know, specifically to the sector, and actually will be financially more affordable than going out to a commercial organisation as well. So I just thought I'd show you a little bit about the product. You can see behind me the Gutman bust made by an disabled artist called Jacko in 2012. And in fact, there is a bronze version of this that is taken to the Paralympic Games in the host country every year as well. And what I've done is I just did a little film of it rotating, but it gives you a bit of an idea of how these images float in there. One of the things that I find that when you go onto some of the big museums and they have 3D scans of objects, the way you access them is almost like you're looking at now. You go onto their webpage and they have some information about it and it goes round. Whereas we really wanted to have that gallery that you could go into and take yourself around, or wear 3D goggles and go around. But when you can manipulate these objects fully, you can actually, this is just doing a rotation, but you can turn them upside down and around. You can focus in, you can look at the texture, you can look at the material. So it's a really great way of accessing things in a way that when you've got your online collections that you can view through whichever system you're using, modes or whatever, you just don't get that that detail in it. So really lovely way for people researching to access our collections. So that's it from me. I think I've come in under the 40 minutes. Hopefully that gives you an overview of what this project is and how important it is to us in terms of developing our collections with the voice of the people whose history this is about. And at the same time, the benefits of that in making those collections much more accessible to many more people, both disabled and non-disabled.
Thank you very much, Vicky. We do have one question in, and as we have a little bit of time before the next talk, I thought I would read it out because it's quite a practical question, and I think it's worth saying it now. So we had a question from Rohan, and that was, how did you provide the equipment for the 3D workshops? Did you have a tech partner, and what broadly did it all cost?
We have got a tech partner. I mentioned the company Ursai, who are doing the training. They are charging, 2 of them come in a day, and they charge us £500 for the day. The equipment we purchased, we did a big research on it. They really helped us with that research, and we just leapt in there to do it. We are also going to be hiring a much smaller scanner, which we think is slightly easier. So you can kind of put the object in and it will scan around it for you. At the moment, it's like a handheld scanner that you go around the object and you have to go up and you have to go under. You probably saw in some of my images, people lying on the floor scanning underneath. Yes, and it's expensive. It was £10,000. So there's a risk in doing that. But we just felt that when you looked at the cost of actually going out to a company and commissioning it, it costs so much. Actually doing it this way round in the long term, you can cover the cost of that and get more objects done. So there was a good argument for us buying the equipment. And as I say, we really hope to share that across with other museums as well.
I was going to say, it's one of those things that perhaps a cohort of museums could get together and share the cost, and, you know, it could be manageable rather than everyone running out and buying their own equipment. Maybe there is a way to kind of partner up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be a really, really great idea. And in our case, we've done it with people with disabilities, but you might have other groups you would like to focus on within your community. And if you teamed up as a team, maybe somebody could do disability groups, maybe somebody does another type of community group, and that would be a great way of sharing across as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I mean, that was a really, really wonderful way to start today. Just a reminder for anyone, feel free to send in your questions via the chat throughout this session. And at the end of our 4 talks, so around 10 to 1, we'll be doing the full Q&A. And I'll be managing the chat. So I'll be monitoring the chat, the questions as they come in, but feel free to use that facility. So thank you very much, Vicky. We are running on time, which is a wonderful thing. So I'll introduce our next speaker, who is Inbal Livni from the Pell Cotton Museum. So I hand over to you.
Hi, I am just trying to work out how to see all the right slides in the right way. So just give me 2 seconds so that I can see you and I can see my slides and everything works at the same time. Hurrah! But now I've lost my other screen. Hang on. We'll get there. We'll get there. Right. share screen. Oh dear, now I've lost that bit. Share screen. Okay. That should have worked. Right. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Right. Thank you very much for having me. I feel like that's a bit of a hard act to follow. That was really fascinating, Vicky, and now I want to go and visit. Just to introduce myself, I'm Inbal. I'm from the Powell Cotton Museum in Birchington in North Kent. I am the head of collections there, and I guess I've been asked to speak to you today because we're developing a number of collections projects, and you know, like many of you, we don't have much money. We're doing these things on a shoestring, although I am going to talk to you about one project which is quite big budget. And we're not, in most cases, this isn't about bringing in new collections. It's about making developments with what we have, with the things that are our kind of unique selling points, but bringing them up to date, thinking about what audiences want to know about them now. And that kind of thing. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So for those of you that haven't been, this is the Powell Cotton Museum. The Powell Cotton Museum, I guess you'd call it a colonial museum. It was built from the 1890s, although the collection predates that slightly, by Percy Powell Cotton. When he inherited his family estate in 1892, he decided to build a museum in his garden. So he had been collecting prior to that and driving his mother mad by putting his acquired things all over the house. There are letters that suggest the kitchen quite often stank because he'd be drying out animal skins in the family kitchen. So I think she was probably quite relieved when he built a museum. The museum was built mostly around his collection of natural history. Percy was a hunter, first and foremost. And in his lifetime, he built 3 galleries that are similar to this one here. This is the last gallery, actually, that Percy built in his lifetime, but confusingly, we call it Gallery 1. So he built 3 of these big galleries of natural history dioramas in his lifetime, and they contain about 300 taxidermied animal specimens. But overall, our natural history collection numbers about 6,000 mammal specimens. Most of it's a research collection that is not on display. And he also collected what was called then ethnographic material, anthropology, world cultures, depending on what term you want to use. And we have about 20,000 material culture objects. So it's actually a very big collection for a very small museum. Percy died in 1940, having made 27 trips to Asia and Africa. He spent 50 years pretty much traveling. And after his death, his wife and then his son took over the museum, and a further 5 galleries were built. So we have 8 in total. And the last of those galleries attaches to the family home, Queck's House, the main living area of which is also, we also look after that. So we have this country house, we have this museum that is the material and animals of mostly Africa, but also Asia. And there's also a large local archaeology collection because Percy's daughter Antoinette spent 30 years digging along the Thanet coastline and collecting archaeology. So it's quite an interesting combination of collections. And Percy was able to do the work that he did because of British colonialism and the colonialism of other European nation states. And so this is very much the colonial museum. And because the family retained overall control of the museum until 2006, his son Christopher was director until his death in 2006, it stayed being framed in a very particular way until quite late in the history of museums. Most museums like this had sort of changed direction much earlier. And so this idea was maintained of one man, one museum. But that's not really true. But I'll come back to that because Percy didn't do this all by himself. For some context, we are an independent charity. We were made a charity in 1926 by Percy following, I'm always very honest about this, by the way, following Christopher Powell Cotton's death in 2006. We got our knuckles wrapped by the Charity Commission because it had basically been run as a bit of family fun until then and not as a proper charity. So there's been a huge overhaul in how the organisation is governed. since 2006, but particularly really in the last few years with some sort of major changes in leadership that have meant we're a much more structured and professional organisation. I joined the organisation in 2013, but it's been really interesting watching that development since then. Financially, how do we survive? I said we're independent. When Percy set up the charity in 1926, he set up a fund that was invested, and we draw down from those investments, or we apply for grants like this one and all sorts of other grants, but we don't get any financial assistance from government. To put us into context of our location, for those of you that don't know Thanet, the Isle of Thanet, as it still remains to be known, has a very island mentality, despite having been connected to the mainland since Roman times. And we have a population, the sort of hyper-local population to the museum is 98% white, which is really interesting given that we are a collection that is mostly African and Asian. The broader Thanet population is sort of 95% white, but it is changing quite a lot and has been changing quite a lot over the past 10 years. There's a lot more movement of people either coming from big cities who want a kind of seaside life, people coming from abroad, and that changing demographic is maybe at odds with some of the local concerns. We are an area that consistently votes sort of quite hard right conservative. You know, this is Nigel Farage's office when he ran to be an MP is on the street behind where I'm sitting right now. And this is an area that overwhelmingly voted for Brexit and has a sort of general suspicion of kind of the outside wider world. So that's quite a challenge for a collection like ours to kind of make those connections. Our users in general, our biggest audience is local families. Over 50% of our audience is local families. That's still quite varied. So we have a lot of intergenerational families, a lot of children with carers, not necessarily parents. We're used a lot by homeschool families who homeschool their children. We also are used quite a lot by older people. We're quite often a stop. I mean, less, not since COVID, but pre-COVID, we'd get a lot of coach tours for older people who would be sort of doing local sites. We're a really good site for anyone who either needs to sit down a lot, or, you know, we get used a lot by SEND schools as well, because we're all on one level. We're a very quiet space, a quiet museum. So we lend ourselves to being kind of really enjoyed by certain groups who aren't our users. I guess the frame young people, 16 to 24-year-olds, unless they've sort of been cajoled into coming by someone else. Up until COVID, we were used quite regularly as part of the sort of foreign language schools and their sort of site visits. So Thanet has a lot of foreign language schools, and they would literally get hundreds of people in their late teens, early 20s every summer who'd come over to learn English, and we were kind of on the itinerary. Obviously, that's all gone completely. It'll be interesting to see if Brexit means that has gone completely or whether it starts to come back. I don't know. Given the local demographic, people of colour tend not to be a large part of our audience, but actually, you know, plenty of people from all over the place visit Thanet, and that is still a demographic from tourism that is not part of our audience. So we definitely have areas that we need to work on, and the two projects that I'm going to talk about today, that's one of the things to some degree they're trying to address. So why make a change now? Well, for 100 years, the Palcotton Museum has, for 100 years, the Palcotton Museum has been a monument to the Palcotton family. But museums aren't monuments, and the museum became an educational charity for the people of Kent in 1926. But the people of Kent aren't the same today as they were 100 years ago. And so if we don't change and make ourselves relevant to today's audience, we're actually no longer meeting our charitable objectives, and the museum will therefore not have a sustainable future. Critically, our understanding of what a museum is, what it is for, and who it is for has radically changed in 100 years, for the better, I believe. We understand that museums are not neutral spaces, and that the stories they tell generally reflect the teller of the tale and not the people who might encounter it or the people represented in our displays in those stories. At the Palcott Museum, we have an amazing archival record, some of which is on this slide here. And this archive that accompanies our collection is really what started us on this journey. The museum had relied for decades on one generation of museum staff handing down stories about the Palcott family and the collection to the next generation. But no one was going back to the archive to check the evidence. And it was only when we started doing this about 4 years ago that we realised how complicit we were as an institution in silencing voices that were key to the museum's narrative, and however unwittingly we were upholding the prejudices and biases that stemmed from the museum's colonial and frankly racist foundations. Sorry, my slides are doing funny things. So before I dive into the two specific projects I'm going to talk about, I just want to give a bit of context into why we're doing this work. Because the museum is undertaking a bigger project. We're closed until April 2023, and we're undertaking something we're calling the Reimagining Project. But the Reimagining Project isn't actually one project, but many little and big ones that come together to present our vision and values for the future of the Palcott Museum. And when we reopen in April 2023, we aim to not only have a new public offer through our displays and our programming, but actually a new culture of working as an organisation that will give the museum a sustainable future. And we want to radically change the way we work with rather than for communities, local and global. And our values will be embedded across the organisation, from visitor experience and collections to operations and HR. And these values relate to everyone who works with us in whatever capacity that might be. And those values are: everybody's lived experience are valued by the organisation, and everyone should be empowered to fulfil their potential. And in this regard, we're working to a principle that equity is as important as equality. We're placing importance on the emotional connections that exist between people and place, and we will have the courage in our convictions, we will be brave in our actions and innovative in our approach. So I realise that this fund, Creative Collections, and therefore this presentation is collections based, but I think it's really important to place the work we're doing in its wider institutional context, because nothing we do with our collections stands in isolation from the rest of the work that we're doing. So in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk about two very different collections projects that look at new ways of thinking about some of our most cherished and well-known objects in new ways and with new perspectives. So I'm going to start with Colonial Critters. So funnily enough, my colleague who is running this project, I was hoping she could be with me today, but she's actually giving a presentation about this project at this exact same time somewhere else, so she couldn't, unfortunately, which is a shame because I'm sure she would have done a much better job than me. Colonial Critters is our flagship project and is run by our Curator of Natural History, Rachel Jennings. We began forming the idea in 2019 when we realised how many exciting stories there were associated with our natural history dioramas that we just weren't telling. And this came from having two members of curatorial staff for the first time, myself running the anthropology collections and Rachel running the natural history. And I would say up until then, until Rachel came in 2018, we'd only ever had one curator looking after everything I was telling you about all at the same time. So that made capacity was a real issue for our ability to do any of this work. And so it was the first time we had capacity to be proactive rather than reactive and really delve into some research. The dioramas are our unique selling point and have remained unchanged for nearly 100 years in some cases. The project aims to tell the social history of natural history and expand the idea that our dioramas are purely science, which they're not, placing them in their colonial context and interrogating why they exist, who they were for, and how they came to be. And the project will reflect on the stories within the dioramas, and each room is going to have its own theme. And these are conservation and climate change, trophy hunting and the history of taxidermy, and animal stories, which will look at the biographical details of some of our displayed specimens. And running through all of this will be people stories, highlighting the many individuals that connect our collections, And this goes back to this idea of dismantling this idea of one man, one museum, because Percy Power Cotton did not build this place alone. He relied on a lot of other people. Colonial Critters started in earnest in January this year. We've had mega delays because of COVID and the building being shut, and then all sorts of remedial work that we had to do when we reopened and realised the roof was leaking and all sorts of other things. And it's split into 3 parts due to run over the next 2.5 years. So part 1 is curatorial research, examining the archive for a better contextual understanding of the history of the collections, the people Percy Power Cotton worked with in Africa and also locally in Kent, because it was local people who built the dioramas themselves, and the life histories and afterlives of some of our most iconic animal specimens. Better collections documentation is a key part of this project. We'll be fully cataloguing the animals in the dioramas and using this project as a test case for thinking more critically about how we decolonise the museum database. Rachel has already started making tweaks to our database so that we can better record the names of Indigenous hunters and collectors and have space to record not just the Latin names of animals, but the local names too, to begin decentering Western taxonomy as the standard way in which we record information. And this is information that we want to be placing into the gallery interpretive text as well. The second aspect of the project is public engagement. Initially, we envisaged this as being less about audience development and more about curatorial collaboration in a similar way that Vicky's been talking about, which is why I've brought this project up today. And things didn't kind of go to plan, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And the third part of the project will be the development and delivery of the new gallery displays and other non-text-based interpretation and design. So this is an iconic image of the Power Cotton, which is of 3 men who saved Percy Power Cotton's life when this lion that is now dead in front of them attacked him. And until now, these men have never been recognised within the gallery, and the story we tell about how Percy's life was saved has kind of completely scrubbed them from history. So this is a really important story for us. We've set some interpretive principles for this project. Firstly, we won't be changing the displays themselves because the dioramas are important historical objects in their own right. Currently, gallery text is a mixture of what I'd call Percy adventure stories and really dry information about biology and ecology that I'm pretty sure no one ever reads. Text is overly long and really hard to read. We did a sort of smog analysis of the text, and it's sort of 17-year-old plus, and for gallery text that's way too high and totally unnecessary. We wanted to put people at the heart of our interpretation, but not all those stories will be gallery text. We're also creating new themed tours and online interpretation to run alongside the gallery displays. When we started the project, the aim was to work with an audience development consultant to help us work directly with our most underrepresented community groups to develop a truly collaborative interpretive framework. We hoped that sharing the curatorial authority in decision-making would show our commitment to more collaborative working and empower people who might have very little experience of museums to be part of the process. We were really open to where this might take our interpretive planning and hence set any parameters beyond the broad gallery themes that I've already said, and that's because we knew that was what our archive reflected. We set out to work with more young people, people in Thanet's more socio-economically deprived areas, and more people of colour, all of whom are noticeably absent from our museum community as visitors, contributors and volunteers. We started working with hybrid consulting in January. Since then, we formed relationships with a number of groups, including Sure Start Centres, who work with new parents, many of whom themselves fall into the category of young people and who are faced with a lot of financial barriers, especially to visit somewhere like the Power Cotton, which I forgot to mention, we have paid entry. So that in itself is another barrier, but that is also how we kind of help make our ends meet. So it's a difficult one. We're working with the University of Kent's East African Society, which has led to a further collaboration with the International Inventories Project. And this is a Kenyan-based project that explores how to digitally connect Kenyan material culture in European museums and challenges Eurocentric ways of interpreting, displaying and understanding Kenyan culture. And this has provided an international dimension and a direct link to communities of origin. And we're also working with Dover Technical College on their Level 3 Diploma in Art and Design, specifically for their module on curation. We started a really interesting series of discussions with local community group People Dem Collective, who work with young people of colour in Thanet, who are involved in the cultural sector and support their development through the creative industries. And they also advocate for Thanet as a tourist destination that reflects people of colour and their interests to diversify Thanet's tourist market. We've developed a really good relationship with them, but they weren't keen to work on this project, and I'll return to that in a minute. It turns out that our assumptions more broadly about how and why people who've never worked with us before and maybe have never visited us might want to now were completely wrong. We had completely wrong assumptions. With each of these groups, we found that while they were really pleased to see us developing our gallery interpretation in ways that were more meaningful to them and respectful of them, they aren't that interested in being involved in the process. Instead, they wanted to set up individual, independent projects that more clearly aligned with their own needs and requirements. So we've rejigged the project quite a bit. Outputs of the various mini projects with each group will still feed into the interpretation, but museum staff will take a greater lead in developing and delivering interpretive content and design. Instead, with our community partners, we'll focus on how we can help them make best use of our resources as a starting point for fostering long-term connections between us and them, and building trust with groups who've not previously felt welcome in our building. So this part of the project has shifted from curatorial collaboration to audience development. So from the point of view of using our museum collections in more creative ways in collaboration with the community, you could say that we've kind of failed to meet our aim. But actually, I think we have met our aim, because when our project didn't meet the needs of our audiences, we adapted it to find new ways of working with them that did meet their needs. And the very fact that we were able and willing to adapt the project, I view as a success, because we are living our organisational values that people matter. And of course, we're still developing our interpretation, and we're still using our collections in ways that are really quite radical for this institution. Flipping the narrative from that of privileged white male hunter to one that many hands, skills and voices made the museum what it is today is massive for a museum that has operated as essentially an unchanging memorial for over 100 years. And it's a way to connect our local audiences with a more global connection. People stories ground alien objects, and many of those stories are in fact quite local, such as Oscar van Oudenhoven, who's on this slide here. The evacuation of Belgian soldiers to Birchington during World War I is a really important facet of local history. So to bring that back into the museum's global story has meaning for our local audiences. It's so well known around here that the museum became a hospital during World War I, and it just sort of connects all these sort of global and local histories. Conversely, Martha Oho, also known as Jo Murfield, was one of countless women associated with the hunting and exploration of Africa by Europeans. Martha was the common law wife of Fred Murfield, naturalist and collector, who obtained hundreds of specimens for the Pal Cotton Museum. How many did Martha take part in acquiring? We don't know, but she has completely vanished from the museum's history, and yet she's sort of there in the archive, whereas Fred Murfield, as a white man, is very prominent. So returning these vanished histories to the museum is vital to our commitment to better representation and better historical context. So I'm going to finish talking about this project by looking at some of the things that we learned along the way, although we're still learning because we're not even halfway. I think we're a third of the way through the project. So firstly, linking our work to the strategic objectives of the organisation got us much better buy-in from our trustees and staff. I realise I didn't put this in there, but this project is funded by the Trust, so they've made a commitment to pull £120,000 out of our reserves to pay for this project. That's a huge commitment. And that comes from the fact that we could prove that this absolutely aligned with the future direction of the organisation, that we put together a sort of business case for this project, and we got everyone on board. It allowed us to create a framework for the next 2 years and will keep us returning to what is most important for the organisation, which means the interpretation is more likely to remain aligned to the overall aims of the reimagining project. Secondly, we made a lot of assumptions about how and why people would want to work with us, and a lot of assumptions about trust. When we started talking in the museum space with colleagues from People Dem Collective, who I mentioned earlier, We hadn't fully considered the emotional burden of them on potentially working with such a colonially violent collection, nor had we considered that they wouldn't want to engage in a project that had already broadly been planned. Ultimately, they felt that being involved in curatorial decision-making wasn't enough, that they needed, quite rightly, to be involved in the entire process of project planning from the beginning, and we hadn't done that. We're still working with them, but actually in the gardens, it turned out that's what they were really interested in. We made an assumption that the museum would be what they were interested in, and it is to a certain degree, but what really piqued their interest was working with our head gardener on projects around food production in the gardens. And so that's where we've sort of, our direction of travel with that group is at the moment. And this links to trust. After a lot of conversations with our community collaborators and in-house staff, we realised that we'd made a lot of assumptions about trust, and we didn't have the right to. The museum has been so excluding for so long and so triggering due to the nature of the displays for many visitors, that people weren't just uninterested, but literally didn't want to set foot in the door. We've got to prove ourselves before people will work with us to develop stories and ideas around such emotionally fraught material. We have to show our commitment that we really mean business and will make those changes. So the interpretive development and research of the project will be much more based around staff doing that work, because we have to show that we really mean this. Having tangible outputs showing we really will put our money where our mouth is and make those changes is what's really important to our visitors, much more than being involved. Come the next gallery redevelopment project in sort of 5 years' time, we will hopefully be in a stronger position when it comes to community trust, and we'll try again at creating these sorts of collaborative partnerships. Colonial Critters has a page on our website, and Rachel, the project curator, writes updates on our blog, and she'd be really happy to talk to anyone who's interested in knowing more. And please do come and have a look when we reopen in April 2023. So the other project I'm going to talk to you about is completely different at the other end of the funding scale, and much smaller in its conception. In early 2021, the Pal Cotton was invited to be part of a new initiative run by the University of Oxford and the Pitt Rivers Museum called Devolving Restitution. The project aims to provide a forum for non-national museums to discuss issues around restitution, provide a safe space for such discussions, and connect UK museum professionals with colleagues in museums across Africa. Pertinent to today, the project also provided funding for project partners to work with community groups in some way to improve collections knowledge, interrogate contested collections, or any other form of curatorial output that we felt suited our museum. Work on Colonial Critters was already underway, and the long, slow process of engaging with new community groups that was happening on that project just wouldn't work with devolving restitution, which had a really quick turnaround time and strict time limitations. Plus, we weren't talking about much money, so we were limited in what we could do. I'd also taken on board some of the issues that we just talked about on Colonial Critters and decided that restitution was such an emotionally fraught issue on all sides, it probably wasn't the project to start with in building trust and new relationships with a brand new group of participants, when I didn't think that the Devolving Restitution project team would give us the support that we needed to do that. And I'd just like to say, I've said that to them as well. Anything I say to you now, I've already said to the project team. So we decided instead to use the opportunity and the funding differently, because we didn't really want to turn down £2,500 of funding. We enlisted the help of the charity Arts Emergency, who work with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who want to work in the creative industries. Many of the young people they work with are part of their mentoring program, but they also connect businesses with internships and help organise and manage the placement process. We got brilliant support and feedback for them in setting up the internship, and if you ever want to set up an internship, I massively recommend them. They made sure that we met all their standards of fair pay, fair recruitment. They helped us advertise. It was a really useful experience for us. We used 3/4 of the project funding and some of our own funds to set up a placement that would see a young person attend all the devolving restitution meetings, which were 6 online full-day workshops over 18 months, to gain experience of the nitty-gritty of museums, how they really work, and how we work through complex issues collaboratively. And between those meetings, we scheduled a series of full days working with me at the museum, going through the process of redeveloping a display that we'd chosen because of the content's connection to the restitution debate. The idea was to take someone who had a real interest in working in museums, but might not have the possibility to volunteer for free, to have on-site museum work experience of everything from research and collections management through to interpretation, development and exhibition design. And at the end of the project, the museum would have a new display, would have had added capacity by having an extra pair of hands, and the intern would have had all this work experience. We were pleased to appoint Samara Abbasi as our intern for the project. Samara came on board about 4 months ago, and she's so far attended one devolving restitution workshop and has had 2 sessions at the museum starting to plan the redisplay of a series of cases in our oldest gallery. And I'm just going to have a look at those and some of the work that we're planning to do there. So we decided as part of this project we would work on our Ethiopian display. The current Ethiopian display dates back to the 1920s. Although the cases have been repainted, some of the paintings have been conserved, and the labels have been reprinted, the objects and the text used is essentially unchanged since 1920. The story they tell is a very particular one. Percy Palcotton, the explorer, getting his hands on a prized curiosity, namely Ethiopian church paintings. The text actually paraphrases his own book on his travels, in which he talks about how he knew he shouldn't buy these paintings, that it was sacrilegious to take them out of the country, but he wanted them, so he did it anyway. So for 100 years, we've had it written on the wall that we hold something that is unique and culturally significant to the people of Ethiopia, and we know that morally at least we shouldn't have it. None of the current interpretation discusses any of the actual content of the paintings themselves in any way, and they are magnificent works of art and they have fascinating narratives and meaning behind them. So it's a story of one historic white man's extraction, and it mirrors the hunting trophies on the wall on the opposite case. So the case here is on the other side of the slide is what this case of paintings looks at. So the entire gallery really is about collecting trophies, be they animal or object. Our original idea for development of this display was pretty humble. We were only going to work on the one case holding the paintings and focus on the labelling as a means to contextualise the story of how the paintings came to the museum and ask them questions about the ethics of museum acquisition. Should we have them? But as Samara and I began researching objects, talking through sort of who our audiences are, what they'd be interested in, and how our work related to the Colonial Critters project, which is encompassing the natural history in this same gallery, we realised that we weren't really focusing in the right place. The provenance of these objects was critically important to a decolonising agenda and telling a more contextual story, but it was also possibly refocusing the interpretation back onto the coloniser, Percy, just in a different way. Rather than glorifying him, we'd suddenly be admonishing him for what he was doing, but he was still the focus. And actually what we needed to do was decenter him completely. Luckily, our research has included the opportunity to talk to experts, such as Alex Wade, who is a PhD candidate looking at British museum collections made in Ethiopia in the 19th and 20th centuries. And talking through the collection with Alex was an opportunity to gain some object-specific insight. As curator of a collection that spans the globe, I look after 20,000 objects. I've got no chance of being an expert in all of it, and building networks of subject specialists is really important. It also helped Alex, I hope, to talk to myself and colleagues who understand the context in which these particular items were collected, which will help the context of her own work. We had a big planning meeting in which we brought together myself, Samara, our intern, Alex, the specialist, our archivist Hazel, because as I said, we have this huge archive, and local writer Lucy Edamati. And Lucy is very interested in the sort of cultural heritage of Thanet. She's also of Nigerian heritage herself, and she's very interested in our reimagining programme and very enthusiastic about providing feedback on aspects of our project that look at restitution and the ethics of museum collections. And we're planning to work with her on a series of writing workshops. So it was a really mixed group of people, and that was really valuable in making changes to something so iconic within the collection. As I say, this display has just always been there, and it was really important to make sure that all those perspectives were heard. And the outcome of this meeting and further research we've done since then was really to expand our ambition. Instead of just looking at the paintings, we're going to redevelop all 3 cases that house the Ethiopian material, and that's what's on this slide here. And they're religious life, or religious art, military life, and daily life. And all 3 displays have been in place since the 1920s, and the third, the daily life display, which is on the left of the screen, currently has no interpretation at all. The labels that you can see in that picture are essentially object labels, and it says things like knife, bracelet. I mean, you know, really useful stuff. So using these universal themes of religion, military life, daily life as a starting point, we'll be telling the stories of Ethiopian art and culture through the objects themselves, decentering Percy Pal-Cotton's Western view and his prejudicial opinions about the art and life of Ethiopia. Some of the objects in these cases have amazing stories, but you wouldn't know it. They tell stories of international trade that didn't include Europeans, the development of artistic styles within Ethiopia that were global in their influence, and the flourishing of a culture that fought really hard to remain outside of European control. And I'm going to finish with one of the objects we're hoping to reinterpret. This image shows around half of a really large panel that's mounted above the cases holding the Ethiopian material. I've taken this image with our ceiling lights on, but normally the gallery is much more dimly lit and it's really hard to see. I'm not sure how many visitors even notice it's there. It's huge, it's about 5 meters long. When Alex Wade came on her research visit, we spent some time examining this piece for the first time. It actually doesn't have a catalogue record, so we have no historic information about the paintings or what it depicts, apart from one line in Percy's journal that says, bought large rolled up paintings, and we can only identify them as being this. And you can see from the top of the image, sort of above, I don't know if you can see my cursor, there's some feet at the top of the image above the saints. So clearly it's been cut from something much, much bigger. But its display is also misleading because it's actually 2 separate paintings. So where I've put this red line, the figure in profile with the blue robe and the blue panel with the figure of Jesus and the men in the boat is actually a completely separate painting. The 2 have been slightly overlapped in the frame to make them fit in this space conveniently. In the dark, with no interpretation, visitors wouldn't know that these were 2 separate things, but it's actually pretty significant. These paintings of saints read a bit like a panel in a comic book, so displaying it in this way completely changes how you might understand it. The 2 halves are painted in quite different styles and have very different wear patterns. So one of my jobs is now to research the figures a bit more and understand the stories so that we can start to see kind of what they might represent and where they might have come from. And this can't be done in isolation. We're going to have to work with more experts because, you know, this is a very specific thing to research. And we're going to go back and do more archival research and work with more subject specialists. And that's one of Samara's roles on the project, is to really get embedded in that research and get in contact with some specialists. The names of the saints are actually written above them on the painting, but it's really quite damaged and we need to find someone who speaks gaze and can kind of interpret that for us. We then have to decide if it needs rehanging. Now that we know that it's 2 pieces and not 1 piece and they have no association with each other, should we be displaying them like this? And that's one of the things that's come out of having the focus of an intern on a very specific project has been a real opportunity, because we've literally been able to interrogate object by object because we've had more capacity, but it's thrown up as many questions as it has answered. So we're hoping that after a bit more research, we'll understand the meaning of the pieces better. Then perhaps we can think about where they might have come from, whether, you know, the bigger pieces that they came from, and think about how they would have been hung and what we want to do with them. So that's just one example of the things that we found through this project that we need to think about. And so the lessons of this project, the display of our Ethiopian material, the redisplay, I should say, has been an opportunity that presented itself out of a completely different project, namely the Devolving Restitution Project, which actually doesn't have within its own aims and objectives anything to do with redisplay or kind of interpretation that has a public face. So we've kind of managed to use the money they've given us in this way to improve our collections. And although the project has another year to run, I think we've learned some useful lessons so far. I think although too many cooks can spoil the broth, it's actually really valuable to get lots of input at the start of a process. Tamara and I had quite a clear idea of how we were going to tackle this display, focusing quite narrowly on the issue of museum ethics, which was very much on our minds because of the nature of the bigger devolving restitution project and the history of our Ethiopian collection. But once we started speaking to subject specialists, looking into our archive and thinking about audience need, we changed our approach quite a lot. And in all likelihood, Samara and I will now do most of the work to rewrite the text and do the research, but we'll definitely go back to our wider group and kind of get their collective input into the text and what we're doing. And linking to that, get help. For many of us at smaller museums, we are overseeing vast collections and we can't possibly be experts on all of it. You know, I've got a PhD, but it's in Tibetan material culture. We hold precisely 120 Tibetan objects in this museum out of 20,000. So, you know, that doesn't do me a lot of good most of the time. I'm, for example, going to be making contact with the British Library, who have Coptic manuscript experts, and others around the UK who specialise in Ethiopian church paintings. And I'd say, like, be a bit ballsy, just email these people and ask them for help, because I've never been turned down. People are always really thrilled to be asked about their niche subject and really want to make sure that we're all doing the best we can for these collections. And thirdly, know your limits and think about whether the thing you want to do is really what's best for the people you might want to work with. And this might seem an odd thing to say, but the team running the Devolving Restitution project were really keen for us to work with a community group. And I pushed back because I knew the scope and scale of their project terms wouldn't allow me to do the work of building trust and developing relationships. And sometimes it's better to just say no. I've said this to the project organisers. I didn't feel that their project team had a clear idea of what community-based curatorial work was, and therefore I didn't think we'd get enough support to do that. But we've been really lucky. We found a different way of using their money that benefited us, that they were still happy with, so it all worked out quite well. But sometimes you have to just sort of navigate the system a little bit, and I think it's important to sort of stick up for your principles and do that. And that's it really. That's my two case studies, and yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you're all scampering back to your desks and getting your Zoom together. We're going to continue with our third speaker today. I'm really pleased to introduce EJ Scott, who actually, we're getting more bang for our buck here because EJ, you're involved with a lot of museums, and I think you're talking about multiple examples from different organizations. So it's not just one organization, you're bringing kind of a wealth of experience and advice and tangible examples. So I'm quite excited to hear about them, and I will hand it over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here, of course. Feel like I'm on home turf here. I'm EJ, and I've been working for about the last 10 years, specifically on projects that have engaged communities that are considered to be marginalized or hard to reach, with collections to produce multiple outputs, different kinds of outputs, and there are different styles of engagement that I do as well. So traditionally, I probably would have been called a curator, but in actual fact, the work that I've been doing really blurs the boundaries between collections management, curation, and community engagement. And it attempts to make a little bit of an effort to chip away at tearing down the walls that divide us departmentally. I mean, at the Tate, for example, we've got a different building for collections than we do for education and community engagement. You know, we're not even in the same buildings. So it's a model that I've been trying to develop whereby these different outreaches come all together, and these different practices come all together, particularly in the writing of the project plan and the grant application process. So I try and tick the boxes across the departments to produce different kinds of outputs and expand the way that we measure impact on collections. What does impact actually look like? What does it mean? Who are you impacting? Is it the museum or is it the community? Or can both things be done at once? What's the legacy of the project? These are the kind of questions that I'm always asking myself when I'm writing the funding applications. I work around the country at various museums. So today what I thought I'd do is just speak to you quickly about thinking about how to define the audiences and the impacts that you might want to measure. But then I'd like to do some surfing of the different websites that I've built around different projects to give you a little bit of a feel of the different styles and the different approaches that we've engaged in order to produce very different shapes and sizes of community engagement. Like I say, I usually specialize in working with what we term marginalized audiences or hard to reach audiences in order to find, unearth, expose what we call hidden histories. But actually, increasingly, I'm not using the term hard to reach. I think some of these terms are slightly passive aggressive. I think that communities aren't hard to reach, they're hardly ever reached out to. Right? They're hardly ever reached. It's not the onus being put on the community being difficult. Actually, we need to think about what's not working on our end that's not enticing them in. Again, I question as well the idea that history is hidden. I think in most instances, the history is there. It's under-researched. It's potentially been erased. It may have even been deliberately ignored. And the work I do with LGBTIQA+ communities, a lot of the times that's actually what it's been. It's been a long history of being censored out. So again, to say it's hidden has this, embeds this idea that it's difficult. It's not difficult. So much of it is just screaming to be interpreted or to have robust research put behind it. So I guess it comes down to this principle of, if you don't see yourself on the walls of a museum, why would you go, right? If there's nothing there that speaks to you with respect and intrigue, why would you be interested in engaging? So a lot of the times what we actually have to do is, rather than thinking that we should expect all of a sudden these communities that traditionally haven't engaged with us within the museum to come knocking down our door because we're going to do something with them now, actually, sometimes we need to go out to their space in order to get them to come in. So this obviously requires staffing, energy, commitment, timing. This is where I say we need to look potentially more closely at writing these grant applications and structuring them, not as only seeing them as community engagement that involves this measuring of how many hours people come into the museum for and how many heads are sitting at the table. In actual fact, we need to think about writing in structures to the grant applications that involve community engagement outside the museum first, and that may be digital. It may be that you're doing outreach via digital engagement to community groups and meeting on their terms externally, but it can also mean physically going to groups and molding the way the project develops with them on their terms in order to have them feel safe or interested in coming into the museum in the first place. If you don't see yourself on the walls of a museum, you're made historically homeless, right? You're told that your community has never contributed anything of value to society, whereas we're holding objects in our collections that prove otherwise. But why on earth we think that we're just going to establish trust immediately because finally we've got off our high horses and are saying, yeah, we're willing to do something with you, even though we haven't for hundreds of years. That's this area of blurring that I want to investigate more deeply and spend time on my work. So I want to start by playing you a little bit of audio, actually. I've been working on a project, and I must say before I crack on and start surfing across a couple of these sites from these community engagement projects, that this is definitely an over 18s presentation. The LGBT content that we produce is unapologetic. A lot of it is risque, a lot of it is cheeky, a lot of it pushes the borders, the edges of museum practice about what the museum feels comfortable doing. We've put human remains on display in Brighton Museum as part of the Museum of Transology, for example, to audiences that allowed children through with a sign that there was adult content or graphic content in it. So some of the stuff that I'm going to show you today is definitely for over 18. So if you're not up for that, please do step away for the next 15 minutes. But one of the projects that I'd like to begin with, I'd like to play a bit of audio. It's from an organization called Ducky. Ducky's the longest running queer performance collective in the UK. They've been going for 26 years now, every Saturday night at the Royal Vauxhall Tavern. And Ducky have expanded their remit to include heritage and heritage collecting, as well as community outreach. So they do a project, for example, called Posh Club, where they take queer performers to under-resourced areas, Hackney, Molescombe, that kind of thing, and do it for the over 60s. For £3, they get high tea, three queer performers, and this cabaret show. So they do these kind of outreach projects, and this is expanded to do heritage projects as well. And the idea with the heritage project is that we call it putting the pub back into public history. So we take communities into the museum, we look at the collections, and then we bring those communities back out with the information that they found about the collections, and they put together things like queer history clubs, Wednesday night event inside the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, where we have 300 people turn up in the middle of winter and nurse a pint and watch 10 volunteers basically report on what they've seen at the museum. And that might be performative. It might actually be an academically robust presentation using a PowerPoint and shots of the collection. And so as part of this project, for the most recent one, looking at the long queer 18th century Georgian period of queer history, we've produced the queer history clubs. We've then taken them on tour across the southeast coast. So the model has rolled out, and the information that we found within the museums has rolled out. And then we've also we're going to produce a performance evening of 10 performances in 10 venues across Vauxhall that are all informed by the research that's been done by the volunteers. And it's like vignettes, and you go to all the different performances across the night. It's going to be fantastic. And we produced a podcast. And in this podcast that I'm going to play you now, I'm interviewing Kate McSweeney from the British Museum, who's the head, she's the the community engagement manager at the British Museum. And I'm asking her what impact the community has on the museum, as opposed to just measuring what impact we have on communities, so that we're trying to level out who's benefiting from this process when we evaluate it. So I'm going to play about 4 minutes of audio, and I hope it's of interest to you. What do you think we bring to the museum? I know what we get from it, and I'll talk about it, but what do you think the museum gets from us coming?
I mean, if in a word, I think it's kind of the bravery, you know, to ask the questions, you know, to say what you see and not necessarily be overthinking, you know, the academic, the thematic, or the kind of collections history, but actually just to ask the questions and be brave enough to ask them. And that is research, you know, it's not too posh or over egging what it is research. And whereas I have colleagues, of course, who've been looking at these kind of queer histories as well through their own work, it's about that collective endeavor to ask questions, to go beyond, you know, what the archive says, what the collections record says, you know, what's been exhibited before, what the label says. And that's a bravery that, you know, shouldn't have to exist, but it is in that context of, you know, those quiet places where, you know, museums were, you know, invented to try and create order and categorize and, you know, and find ways of explaining the world. and that's not how it is anymore. And that's not just, you know, queer researchers coming in. That's about non-museum people putting their eyes on collections, people who haven't, you know, spent years doing it in a certain way. And that's what that new perspective, new eyes, new brains, new ways of thinking, and that, you know, ability to ask questions that perhaps haven't even been thought of in that particular context before.
Yeah. Do you think there's something about kind of us as queer people, like looking at things in a different way, looking for ourselves in a very different way? Or, you know, I think EJ said before about kind of it takes one to know one.
Yeah, I imagine it helps. But certainly I think there's, you know, people recognize these histories, they recognize themselves or people like them in the past, but perhaps doing this together with people who haven't been thinking about it in that way or looking at their collections in that way is helping to surface some of these stories. And certainly, I think, you know, these histories haven't been brought out to the public, you know, in the grand scale of the public in any way outside of some, you know, LGBTQI themed exhibitions or displays. And so bringing in that diversity of thought and diversity of perspective really does help to, you know, those histories are there. They're not hidden. They're pretty obvious a lot of times, but it's about surfacing them, and it's about giving them time, and about taking the time to research them and to unveil them, you know, and to bring them to kind of the eyes of the museum really as well, because often that there just hasn't been that considered effort to do that in the past, outside of, you know, a couple of displays, exhibitions, or people who've been looking at that themselves.
And do you think as well, like us being not academics in a way, you know, we're not so desperate to have like solid proof, and so maybe we're more kind of open to those conversations and going like, oh, hang on, they live together, you know, like two women slept together in the same bed, obviously they're lesbians, without actually having to have kind of, you know, eyewitness accounts or things that academics quite often do want.
Yeah, maybe, or just maybe not the kind of the dogma of proof, you know, where academia often asks for, you know, 10 different types of evidence to, you know, prove a theory. And actually it's around asking those questions of the evidence that is there, actually, and kind of saying, well, this is what we're seeing, this is what happened, you know, what kind of, you know, conclusions can we draw? And that goes back to, again, this idea of, well, what is research? What is evidence? What is proof? What is truth? And perhaps, yes, bringing that, you know, perspective to a collection that has never been looked at like that before does help and does raise those questions, because, you know, research is questions, right? It's about questions, looking for answers, and those questions help with that process for sure.
But also as well, I suppose, because we're not, you know, there isn't the same sort of level of shame attached to those kind of histories, and so, you know, now when we talk about it, we're not, you know, the family isn't necessarily going to sue for libel because we haven't got kind of, you know, 100% proof.
Yeah, and I think there's also something around kind of the freedom to do that, you know, to look at the collections in that way when they haven't been looked at that way before. So museums traditionally, and places like the British Museum being one of them, tend to categorize objects and research into looking at things in particular ways. So it might be around materiality, it might be around, you know, provenance, it might be around, you know, who made it or how it was made. And actually thinking, you know, kind of thematically around kind of the holistic meaning of objects and stories and histories allows for those questions to be unpicked a little bit. So, you know, some of the collections that we looked at may have been looked at before. So say some of the Chevalier d'Eon prints, they may have been looked at in terms of the kind of the artistic style of them, or they may have been looked at that moment in history, but actually bringing together history, context, perspective, and lived experience allows, you know, for those conversations and those questions to be done in a very different way than, say, perhaps someone who is a specialist in 18th century engraving, you know, if that's, so it's bringing those specialisms, I think, in and recognizing them as specialisms, lived experience and perspective, and all the research that you did in other places, and bringing that into the British Museum and adding that nuance to the collections that are here.
So Kate has, I think, really hit the nail on the head when she's talked about this idea that different voices come in, can add different layers of interpretation. There's a tension there, obviously, between the way in which we categorize and explain and research, particularly at a high academic level, and the community interpretation. These aren't the same things, they're two different products. And so how do we then marry these products when we're looking at impacting on the collection? I think there's actually a couple of different elements that are going on in that question. One is that I've identified that there's different types of community members who want to engage with the collections. So there's users who want to contribute a new object to the collection. And a good example of that, I think, is here with the Museum of Transology. This is a collection of over 400 objects now that have been all crowdsourced from the community to represent a sector of society that's not only critically marginalized within broader society, but that is largely overlooked and not included within museum narratives. And it's often a community that we struggle to find objects that represents them fairly, if indeed we can find objects at all. So the idea for this project was that we would collect directly from the community, and it's now thought to be the biggest collection of objects of material culture relating to trans lives anywhere in the world. It was on show as an exhibition at Brighton Museum and Art Gallery for 2 years, from 2017 to 2019, but it's now held permanently at the Bishopsgate Institute in London. And the idea was that the community itself sourced the object and decided what objects would go into it, and would then write the narrative themselves of the object so that they became the curators of their own stories. I love this one. It's a pair of boxer shorts from a young person who was transitioning called Stripy Monstrosity. At the start of my transition, I asked my mum for some boxers and she came back with this, and it's double underlined with an exclamation mark. As lovely as she is, I couldn't wait to pluck up the courage to go and buy something less tragic, right? What's really nice about it is that it's an everyday object that speaks to everyday experiences, but it's not an object about transness. It's an object about growing up. And so it really connects the audience through this familiarity with the object, with a story that they feel very disconnected from, with a community that they feel very far away from. And so there's a lot of validity in thinking about when you're getting audiences to contribute new objects to the collection to fill gaps, about how you measure the validity of that object. What will you accept? Will you accept a really beaten up, I'm going to show you another one, there's graphic content in this section, by the way, really beaten up lipstick like this, that's not a lipstick, you know, that's got a whopping big brand name on it. It's not the very best of art and design by any stretch of the imagination. It's not Chanel, it's not Yves Saint Laurent. It's definitely come from Boots or Sully's, right? It's cost a couple of quid. It's been kicking around in a handbag for too long. It's scratched, it's melted, right? But it's clearly adored. And it says, this lipstick was from my wonderful sister, who was the first family member to accept and support my transition. What's extraordinary about it is that she'd had the object for over 10 years, and there's multiple objects within the collection of the Museum of Transology where people have held, there's some objects that are older than 20, that are you know, kicking on to nearly 30 years old. Once these are obviously very precious, they've been kept in people's collections at home. People have been saving their own ancestry, even though the museums haven't been doing it. They've started this vibrant culture of collecting themselves. But when they were offered the opportunity to put it into a museum, they flocked to the party, right? They couldn't wait to share this precious object and this precious story with the public. So they weren't only saving it for them, this history for themselves, they were actually saving it with the intention of wanting to share the story as well. So I think this collection brings up this idea that we can crowdsource objects, but we need to be careful about not necessarily looking for the very best in art and design. When we do it, we need to think about the stories that they are contributing, the provenance they are contributing, as much as the object itself. So that's the user who wants to contribute a new object to the collection. There's also contributors who want to add knowledge to something in your collection. And this could be reinterpretation of existing narratives, potentially that have been written through a colonial lens or through a cis-normative lens, through a lens of privilege or through eliteness. They want to challenge this. It may be to do with something that is being considered for repatriation, or the community wants to revise language that they feel is misrepresentative or incorrect or offensive, right? And so this process of reinterpretation and revising language works very well when, for example, the V&A recently devised a list of new tags to add to the collections database, right? So they've added 29 new terms that were devised in collaboration with the community in order to look at objects in the collection that could then be made searchable. And it's a very worthwhile output because it opens up the collection to broader audiences, right? And so this brings us to this process of not only trying to produce outputs that may be an exhibition or a display, but looking deeply at opportunities we have to better know our collections through community engagement and measuring that as an output, and therefore putting that into the project plan, whereby you're not just looking at writing in staff time and the hours you can get from your community engagement officer. You're writing in staff time that is for your collections management team, right? Or your collections manager, that you're giving time to your curator and to your collections manager in their workload as part of their workload, not an add-on that either never gets up, you never get caught up to it, right? It just never gets done when the project ends because the curators don't have the time of the day to do it, or it's overlooked as part of something that can give back to both the community and to the museum, and it simply doesn't get done. Structuring in how to reinterpret and do that data entry is something that is so often overlooked. Of course, there's also reinterpretation that can be done of the object. And this is a project, I'm just flagging a couple of different projects so that you're familiar with them, and then you can go away and have a look at them yourselves. But this is a project called West Yorkshire Queer Stories that was done in collaboration with the West Yorkshire Archives, with a community group called MESMAC, a sexual health service called MESMAC, that also uses their rooms for community engagement, and with Leeds City Museum and Leeds Art Gallery. And it was a project that ran for 3 years, funded by Heritage Lottery Fund, and it ran with 75 volunteers who went out into the community and recorded each other's oral histories. But it didn't stop then ran a photography project that aligned with the oral histories, and then came back and found objects that related to these oral histories and built a collection for the museum that was supported by the stories behind them. So what's, I think, so effective about this is the interpretation. For example, when you go into the idea of these films here, let me find them for you. There's 10 short films that are built about the objects themselves, where the community is talking and holding the object that then goes into the collection. So you're building this layer of interpretation that doesn't go through the museum lens, that's directly the voice of the communities underpinning the new object that goes in. So in total, the other thing I think that's worked so well about it is that the project included the community transcribing and selecting edits of the oral histories. Oral histories can be incredibly impenetrable, right? They can be an hour long with someone talking and you don't have the time to listen to them, and you can't search in them because they're audio and you don't have the facilities online. So this project chose, for example, you can see a 5-minute highlight here. It chose to have a look at to transcribe the oral history highlights, then to tag with the key words, and then the key words are then added to be able to make these searchable categories so that people can search for exactly the type of story that they're looking for. So again, that's another way of thinking about how you can underpin the collection with voices of the community. And finally, because I know I'm running out of time, I want to talk to you about how you can actually think about potentially making your own website collections database usable by the community in a valuable way. And so for the Old Police Cells Museum, we just scrapped modes, I know, controversial, and we took on board instead a collections database system called Catalog It. And I'm going to show just really quickly, in Catalog It, the beauty is that you can have multiple users using the database off-site. And so we've set up a digitization station, which really is a fancy word for having a little camera and a light box inside the museum. The volunteers come in on a Saturday, they photograph the object that they're interested in reading, they go away, and we've got experts on the team, like everyone does with specialist interest within your volunteer base, and they go away, and we have a digitization team and a catalog team that numbers and does the accessioning, does the background paperwork behind it, the collections management, but they can add in the context and the research that they've done, and they can do it off site, and it then becomes completely searchable. And so this way of rethinking the collections databases, you don't need to scrap modes if you've got 200,000 objects, obviously, on it. It's just a no-go. But this database only costs £300 a year. So your grant can pay for that to build an on-site website of a specialist interest collection that is interpreted by the community, that can add depth to, for example, a blog, that can be a link on your existing website. So I'm going to leave it there because I've run out of time, but I think the moral of the story is there's multiple approaches you can take with multiple communities using different databases and different methodologies to embed their voices into the collection that leaves a lasting legacy, that also empowers them to feel like they've had some control over the narrative that they've been involved in creating. And giving autonomy back to the communities at the end of the day is going to be what makes them feel like they have power within the museum, and this is the key to getting them to come back. So I'm looking forward to having questions later. I hope that was helpful.
Hi, yeah, it was helpful. In fact, it was addressing one of my big questions, because I've seen over the years a lot of museums who have really active and brave, I think, community engagement programs. But quite often that work happens and it's never captured in a more permanent way within the systems, the pre-existing systems. And I think it's interesting that not just you, but some of the other speakers were, talking about just, challenging some of the ways that we've collected and documented information around contemporary collecting, especially, and making the time. It's a resource issue, and really committing to that resource time, but really fascinating to actually challenge the whole idea of the technology that you're using or the database that you're using. Is that the right thing, to capture?
And also to writing into that project plan the tying up and the impact on the collections, so that it just doesn't go by the wayside. We write the community engagement plans, but we don't write teaching our communities how to conserve their own collections better. We don't teach our communities how to archive the collections themselves at a basic level, so that by the time they get to the museum, the collections that they're talking about are in better condition and take less work on our end as well. So they're in better condition and better nick, so they will last longer and be more precious within the museum as well. But actually they can do part of this work for us about having the provenance prepared, and then there's the rereading of the objects within the museum. We don't write space into the project plans for them to be sat and taught how to use modes and how to add tags. It's very, very rare that the projects include this part of the process. And that's certainly something that I'm going to work at in future projects, at really shifting the focus away from solely being exhibition making into collections legacy and community archiving and conservation. Yeah,
and I know that conversations with the Arts Council and other major funders, they are more supportive and really open to this idea of research and development, and recognizing that that's a huge part of changing the way that museums work. Yeah, and yet we shy away from it, and we kind of underplay it or assume that we've got to absorb all the research and development before we apply for the grant for the final, public display or exhibition.
100%, I couldn't agree with you more. And in actual fact, we also don't measure how this impacts on marginalized communities, because if you can give them some basic archival skills, you're increasing their employability and you're encouraging them to be part of the heritage sector long term. And long term, the impact on the heritage sector is that we get a more diversified workforce, So in actual fact, this skill building as part of the process is really, really valuable, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I look forward to seeing some of the questions come through on the chat, and we'll put them into the pot for later on. But thank you very much, EJ. I enjoyed that. So now we're going to move on to our final session, and that is 2 speakers from Hastings Museum and Art Gallery. We've got Philip Hadlin and Jasmine Miles Long as well. So welcome to both of you.
Hello.
Hello. And I want to make sure we've got Jasmine here as well.
Hiya, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Cool.
There we go. I can see you.
Phil's going to go first, I think, and then me afterwards.
Great. So I will
Okay, I'll share my screen then. Hopefully. There we go. Okay, are we there? Somebody shout if they can't see anything.
We can see your screen.
Okay. There's just our animated museum logo. So I'm talking about our What's in the Box project and a specific strand of it. We've been looking at natural science collections, but a little bit about What's in the Box. So it's a museum collections-based community engagement project, and there were actually 3 strands. One looked at collections with LGBTQ+ community, and another strand looked at collections with the refugee community. But in this strand, which I was leading on, was with home educating families, and we decided we were going to document our natural science collections, and it was all funded through the Arts Council National Lottery project grant. So this summary of aims is to develop audiences and new partnerships, developing our programme, and include the community voice in our displays and outputs, and expand our impact. And of course, improving the accessibility of HMAG's collections is paramount. So first of all, I obviously had to recruit some participants from the home educating community, which is quite large in Hastings. And so that was through direct contact with local home education networks and groups on Facebook, and also a little bit as the project progressed and through word of mouth. And we decided we were going to do some taster activities, which were scheduled to happen at the museum in summer 2020. But then, of course, lockdown happened. So I devised a few virtual activities to send out to people interested in getting involved. And this one was Rock Around Hastings, which was encouraging people to go out and look for local rocks and describe them and send us the details, and then we'd make a map of different rocks. So the state of the collections, which we wanted to address through this project, they were generally poorly documented. We didn't know much about them at all, and a lot of them were pest damaged, poorly stored, and not being used. And here's a picture of an example of one of the boxes of fossils. We didn't actually work on this box because we focused in on things like skulls first, and later our marine biology collections. Anyway, so each student, each of the children who were participating were given a box of kit, so sort of a documentation kit they could use throughout the project. And we let them make some kaleidoscope patterns from imaging the displays, and use those along with recycled old magazines, a good use for those old museums journals, to decorate their boxes. And we also gave them each a book, a journal, so that they could record their activities through the project. So the participants documented and photographed hundreds of objects, but they also completed creative activities such as making stop motion animations inspired by their favourite objects. Hopefully this works. Okay, and another of the outputs, because we had a lockdown, we couldn't do things in the museum. So one of the things we did was create a co-curated exhibition of a lot of the skulls and bones that we were documenting. And so this included audio commentary from some of the participants as well. Some of them wrote poems, some of them made posters, campaigning for conservation, that sort of thing. And that was on a program online. It's free as well. It's called Art Steps, where you can create your own exhibition. So here's a picture of us documenting some of the animal skulls, which are many and varied. We had everything from a echidna skull through to a plaster cast of a gorilla skull and a pilot whale skull that was found in Alexandra Park and had a wasp nest in it. But we also discovered some really interesting things that we didn't know we had. There's these Venus flower baskets, from the HMS Challenger expedition, and given to us by Miss King in 1939, belonged to her great-grandfather, Mr. W. King, who was a schoolmaster at a local school, but we don't really know much about him or how he came across these. Was he on the crew of HMS Challenger? I don't know. Anyway, so we were quite inspired by our marine biology collections, so we decided to, because we couldn't, again, we weren't able to have a physical exhibition at the end of the project, which was really the first idea. We decided to have some sessions run by some creative practitioners. By Dulwich Theatre Rotto, who ran, supported by Strandliners, marine conservation sessions where we created, learned about marine conservation through Strandliners and all about plastic pollution and whatnot. And then we created puppetry workshops and puppetry pieces, which will be shared soon on our social media when the video is finished, which sort of summarizes everything. So they were making sort of shadow puppets and that sort of thing, and doing their own performances. And we also invited additional families to get involved, because a lot of families have been homeschooling during the pandemic, so we thought it would be nice to invite other families along as well. So the impact, parents are really positive about it, both for the children and themselves. And they reported that looking at the objects was magical, exciting, sparking their interest in research. And we also found that participants were learning new skills and gained confidence as well. One of the parents said that a particular benefit was that it was providing experience of the world of work, as well as a learning opportunity in a calm, personalised environment. And one said it's like being a curator, and another said it's really good for children who are sensitive to multisensory, noisy, busy environments, etc. Some of the key takeaways: have a plan B in case of lockdowns. We already made a plan B because we expected to be locked down. That we would do some virtual engagement via Microsoft Teams, and more about that in a bit. Communication is number one, so setting aside time for a good welcoming email to participants is time well spent, because it's very easy to put people off if they, if something looks very dry and unexciting. Find out about your participants, what do they like, what do they learn, what do they need as well. Keep in mind broad learning preferences and the differences of your participants. Some might be very, outgoing and loud, some might be really quiet, some might prefer working with others, or some might prefer working individually. And so try to sort of group similar ages and learning styles and personalities to some extent. Obviously you can't sort of do everything, but you can try your best. And remember that you're working with adults as well as the children, so they should benefit as well. And build trust slowly, so not sort of rush into relationship building. Start things simple and then develop things as you go. And vary your activities and provide choice, so we're not doing the same thing all the time. So we did this by sort of providing different options for their contributions to the exhibitions, the online exhibitions, and also by varying what objects they were working with throughout these sessions. And yeah, be flexible and prepared to change direction, which is, I think, pretty much expected nowadays, what with the COVID pandemic. The simple version of the Spectrum documentation framework was really quite effective, and I was actually really surprised how well they took to it, doing the measuring and the looking for the numbers on the objects and the photography. And they really valued the specialist expertise from the curators and the sessions which Jasmine was running, which we'll talk about in a bit. One other thing, Microsoft Teams is very unpopular compared to Zoom with general family audiences. That's what we found, and other people probably found the same. But we were only allowed to use Microsoft Teams as a council, so that provided a bit of an issue sometimes, because it was difficult to get the online engagement going with some of the families. A few statistics. I don't think I'll go through all these, but we had a total of 48 participants. 30 of those were children, 18 were adults. Half of them were only involved throughout the core of the project, documenting objects, and then the other half joined us for the Carnival of the Deep. That was more recently. So the benefits for the collections were improved documentation and collections care, increased institutional knowledge of the collections, because when I started this, I had no idea what was in these boxes of undocumented stuff. And so we've learned more about the collections and their history, but there's still more to know. Who was Mr. King, for example? The application of the subject specialist knowledge, that sort of not just the sort of knowledge of natural history collections, but also of collections care in general. And the potential of the collections, I feel, has been improved. So I can see potentially we'll be using some of these objects in future exhibitions and permanent displays. And the collections are being seen and used as well, which is, if we don't use the collections, what's the point of having them? So the next steps, final evaluation reports will be coming out, and then basically this project feeds into our wider ambition to be a community museum. I like to think that we already are with our work involving our communities in developing the future of the museum, and we'll apply the methods and learning in this project to the next project, which is funded by Esme Fairbairn Effective Collections. And my plan is that they'll be looking at the archaeology collections, which I manage as well. So who knows what we will find in them. And thanks to these guys, all my colleagues, and Jasmine and Mima Bone, who's one of the key gatekeepers to home educating families locally, and our evaluator Chris, and the participants and the workshop deliverers. The other thing I've been asked to talk about is Hastings Digital Quilt. So throughout the pandemic, we had the thing called Hastings Digital Museum, and we got some funding to run some activities that were delivered by freelancers. And one in particular was the digital quilt, and this is just a sort of a menu of the things we might have on in a typical week that we post on top of our Twitter and Facebook. Anyway, so I've just got this video to show you, and hopefully it works. It's hosted on our Facebook page, so we might not watch the whole thing because of time limitations, but here we go. So the digital quilt was inspired by a painting in our collection, and it was split up into lots of different sections, and each section was given to a person who signed up to take part, and they each used innovative, different ways to recreate that part of the painting. So some using seeds, some using felt tips, some using bits and pieces, beads and things like jewelry, some using shells. I ended up doing one myself. I used some pebbles. So you can see, as you can see, lots and lots of different materials used. One using pasta there. I really like this one, the use of the landscape as well as the sort of the shapes.
Philip, I'm only seeing the photograph of the whole quilt. Is that
okay? It's not working then. What I'll do is I'll post a link to it in the chat.
Okay, that's great.
Okay. Sorry about that. Right, I'll go back to the PowerPoint. I don't know what went wrong there. I think my original plan was to have it in the talk, but it ended up being a massive file, which was a bit unwieldy. Okay, so there's the finished digital quilt. Hopefully everybody can see that. So lots and lots of different squares done by different people in different ways. And I'll post the link to the video in the chat. And one idea we had was to actually try and make a bit of money out of the digital quilt. So we got permission from everybody, and it's hosted on Art UK. So you can actually buy a print of the Hastings digital quilt. The idea being that this helps fund the museum and its collections work. And yeah, just the logos. So that's it from me, and then Jasmine's going to talk about her work with us on the What's in a Box project.
Okay, should we switch over? Okay, so my internet seems like it might be a bit funny. So when I go into my shared screen, I can't see you anymore for some reason on my laptop. So if you can't hear me, shout, because I can't see you waving. Is that okay? Okay. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay. So, okay. Can you all, oh, I can see you. Look at that. It's different this time. Maybe I'll squish you to one side. Maybe I'll minimize it. There we go. So let me check I can, sorry. Okay, it's working. So I'm a taxidermist, artist, educator, and natural history restorer. And I often refer to myself as an ethical taxidermist because I only produce work using animals that have died from natural causes. And I work with museums, giving talks and workshops to visitors, offering an understanding of the taxidermy process and promoting the scientific and cultural benefits of this intricate and evolving craft. And this is just an image of a previous talk at the Booth Museum in Brighton. And for the past year and a half, actually, since kind of the first lockdown, I started working with Hastings Museum, which was amazing, on a few different community projects for their digital museum. And one of these projects was What's in the Box. And firstly, when I was asked to be part of What's in the Box, I was just taken back by how wonderful the project was, and felt so honoured to be part of it. You know, so well done, Phil and Casey. If I'd have had this kind of opportunity when I was school age, I would have just found it incredible. And I just felt so, I just felt like all of the families were just so lucky to be involved, and kind of, you know, really felt like they were working within a museum and getting that kind of work experience, especially during, you know, COVID times when it felt very strange. It just felt like a very productive thing to be doing. Anyway, so when I came for my session with the families, they'd already been working with the museum for a few weeks. So, you know, they had quite a lot of confidence within the museum environment, and they, you know, they'd seen the Natural History Gallery and they'd been documenting and handling lots of the, you know, especially the skulls from the collection. So they, you know, they kind of had confidence when I was coming in as a taxidermist. But in my specific session, we focused on the taxidermy within the collection, and specifically conservation needs of a natural history collection. And so first of all, I asked the students how they thought taxidermy was created. And doing this was a really good way to gauge the confidence level of a participant, for example, and also how interested they were with taxidermy objects themselves, because even though they're working with a museum, it doesn't mean that they're actually interested in the natural history section of it. And often people may have preconceptions of what taxidermy is, and therefore it can be, you know, somewhat of a love or hate situation. So it's good to know if I'm going to be working with someone who's already excited by the subject or someone that needs convincing. One of the students, for example, was already, you know, dreaming of the day she could be a taxidermist herself. So therefore, she was looking forward to meeting me. And the workshop with that family was an utter pleasure, and I could have stayed with them all day. But others did need convincing. And I did this by asking what their own interests were, trying to tie these into the craft of taxidermy some way. So, for example, one student really liked collecting very old books. And the materials we were going to use in the crafting section of my workshop were the same materials a paper conservationist would also use. So the activity became really exciting for this student after that kind of connection of their interests and my interests. And it's tricky to go off script when presenting a talk, but it's, you know, pretty integral when working with family groups, I find, you know, and letting them guide me really helps to engage them with the taxidermy itself. That they may have, you know, found a bit kind of off-putting before the beginning of the talk. And I started my session by giving a little introduction to who I was, the history of taxidermy, and why taxidermy is, you know, still very relevant and important today. And each family group had an iPad that you can see in this image, with a little PowerPoint presentation of images that they could scroll through themselves to support and illustrate some of what I was trying to explain. I also used taxidermy objects from the museum collection as examples, and also my own handling objects that you can see they've got on the table there, such as Brian the Fox. I don't know if the actual clip that Phil had in his talk played, because I couldn't hear it, but one of the clips in his talk was this family. You can see this girl stroking the fox here, and she just absolutely loved the session. But Brian the Fox is kind of a non-toxic handling specimen of mine. For anyone that knows about about natural history collections, or anything kind of pre-1980 may have toxic chemicals in it. So it's really important if you're using handling collections to make sure that they don't contain any of these problematic things within them. Okay, lost my train of thought. Oh, okay, so I find it's really important when explaining how taxidermy is created to actually have a mixture of objects and images that they can touch, showing the process, to help explain how taxidermy is created. Everyone learns in such a different way and processes information differently, and often seeing or touching something can just make such a huge difference in understanding how something's made. And I find it's also really important for the person to understand how taxidermy is made, and that it's not simply just a dead animal, but in fact a crafted object. Helps them to understand how very fragile these objects are, and to truly understand the vulnerability of them. And through learning about how these objects are made with this family groups, and about how fragile they are, we went on to look at how these objects are cared for within the museum environment and the risks for damage. And I used the Hastings Museum's platypus, which you can see in this image, as a case study. And we looked at images of the object and damage caused due to insects, material degradation, dust, and storage. And we discussed signs of damage to look for when working with a collection. And also the risks to ourselves when working with historic taxidermy. So this particular object was created, pre-1950, and so most probably contains arsenic. I'd say it definitely does contain arsenic. Arsenic was used as an insecticide in the form of a taxidermist soap, and was painted on the inside of the prepared skin before it was mounted into taxidermy. And this platypus had powder. You can see in this image kind of leaching from some of the seams. This could be borax, which is kind of like a type of salt that we use to also to ward off insects and other reasons, but it could also be, the arsenic soap, or it could be plaster. But, not knowing what it is, makes it a hazardous object. And so we looked at images of this object rather than the object itself, and talked about the importance of PPE when working with historic taxidermy. I showed examples of this is like a moth case on the platypus as well. So we talked about, the different things that can harm taxidermy. And then we talked about remedial conservation and restoration, and the different methods used, and the reasons for non-permanent materials versus permanent materials used in conservation. And we ended the session with a crafting activity so that the participants could get involved, and they created swatches of fake fur using Japanese tissue paper. This technique is used as a non-permanent treatment to replace lost fur on damaged taxidermy mammals. And the paper is stained, so you can see here just some swatches of the Japanese tissue that have been stained to different colours. And so you would colour match it to the fur you're going to use, and then it's layered up and attached to the object. And then I've just got an example here, and I showed the students these images as well as part of my talk. This is an example of me using the technique, and this is a collie from the Booth Museum's collection. And you can see for the collie, I'm like ripping bits of the Japanese tissue, and this image shows you the before and after. So you can see the bridge of the dog's nose or muzzle is balding, and then on the right side of the screen, I'm not sure if it's flipped on your screens or not, but you can see one of the images, he's got a furry nose. And that's because I've layered up this Japanese tissue to create this kind of fake fur effect. And it's really important to use, the tissue rather than something that contains DNA from a different animal, like grafting fur from a different specimen would be problematic, because if it's an an object of importance and a DNA sample is taken from the object, this would cause contamination. So using paper doesn't create these kind of problems. And all of the students really seemed to love this activity, I think mostly because it was so unusual. And they all talked about how they would transfer this technique into their own crafting projects at home, especially as they've been doing model making for their stop motion animations already at the museum. So they were excited about learning a new craft technique that could be used to create texture on these models they've been making. So this is what their swatches looked like at the end. It was literally just like a patch of fur that essentially you would cut and then, you know, place into a taxidermy mammal. And we also created a video for the families as part of what's in the box. For the families that could not attend the sessions at the museum due to COVID reasons, which I guess is kind of part of, as Phil was saying, the plan B, especially these days. You know, not everyone can attend, and ideally real life is much more engaging, but it's important to give different options. And the video was also shared with the wider Hastings Museum audience via the museum's social media. And in the video, I talk about the role of natural history conservation and restoration within the museum. And I use the stingray from the museum's collection as a case study whilst restoring it as part of the process. So as well as the museum getting the video, they also got their stingray, you know, cleaned and all of its cracks fixed and everything and restored. And if you want to see this video, you can go to the Hastings Museum social media, or I don't know if you can see this. You can, on my website, there is a section, so jasminemarsLong.com, there's a video section on the website, which shows all of the videos that I've created with Hastings Museum over the last year and a half now for their Hastings Digital Museum project. And that, now I need to unshare my screen. Yep, I don't know how to do that. Anybody? Oh, here we go. Okay, that's really obvious.
That's great. Thank you very much. Really interesting and like an incredibly diverse range of examples this morning, which kind of goes to show, you know, there are a lot of different approaches to developing one's collections and also working with communities and bringing in subject specialists and so forth. You know, there's so many different ways to do it. So I think it's a really great example of just so many different ideas, different approaches that museums can consider. We've come to the Q&A section of our talk this morning. So I've got a few questions that have been lined up in the chat. I've also have a few links that have appeared. So as some of our speakers have mentioned, resources like Art Steps and Catalog It, and the Hastings team have kind of referenced some of links to their material as well. So I will save those, and when we send out the evaluation tomorrow or next week to assess the session, we'll include that in the email so that you've got reference to those resources, because I think it's really interesting how individuals, what tools people are using, you know, to do this work. So feel free to add questions in the chat, but in the meantime, I will look at some of the questions that have already been asked. For those of you who've just been speaking, sip your water, get yourself refreshed and rehydrated. So the first question I have is to Inbal, and it was just a really practical question. Actually, you were talking about working with interns, and the question is from Stephen. Can you remind us who you used for getting help with terms and conditions and best practice for seeking interns?
Yeah, so we worked with Arts Emergency, who are a charity. I mean, they are based nationally, but a lot of the work they do is focused on Thanet, London and Manchester. I know they're expanding into Birmingham, and they work in other areas as well. Their main focus is providing mentoring for young people from disadvantaged communities who want to get into the arts and don't have some of those traditional routes in, because they can't afford to volunteer. As many of us know, you know, volunteering is a way for free, or they are from backgrounds that are communities that are not well represented in museums. So much as EJ was saying, if you don't see yourself there, why would you want to work there? You don't feel you have a place there. So it's sort of providing those experiences, but they've more and more. So a lot of those mentorships are with younger people, so sort of 16 to 18, and more they're continuing to work with their young people as they get a bit older. And then actually what those young people are looking for is work experience. So I know that more and more they're interested in finding paid internships that give real world experience of what it means to work in the heritage sector. And they're just brilliant, and they, you know, they mirror a lot of our values. So I won't ask anyone to do anything like that for free. Yes, we have volunteering opportunities, but this is a piece of work that needs doing. Someone should be paid for that piece of work. And so a lot of our values reflect theirs. And they just provided us with a really good grounding, and they were really honest. Like I wrote a job description and I got it back covered in red pen, because they were like, don't you want to encourage a young person to do this? And I'd sort of gone all traditionally museumy in how I'd written this job description. So they helped me through that. And yeah, so they were brilliant, and I'd absolutely recommend to anyone to work with them.
Thank you. I've got a question for EJ. So this one is from Stephen, and it says, a lot of the best engagement practice is on social media. So how can this be captured onto a project database? We can see that modes would struggle with this kind of thing.
And modes would struggle, you're absolutely right. And this is about old technologies holding us to ransom because of the amount of labor that's embedded in them. We at some stage have to start thinking about what are our digital archiving policies? How are we need to collect digitally. These are policies that need to be written with expert advice. And we need to think about how are we going to move forward and not let this really important mode of history making slip through our fingers. Because I had the person, I'm going to put it in chat now, the person you might want to touch base with or read some of their work, Sharon Webb up at Sussex University, is a specialist in digital archiving. And I heard her talk and she said something that's really, really resonated, stuck with me. And that's that paper is much more durable and will last a lot longer in the archive than a digital file. That digital files corrupt, the technology changes, right? So for all these reasons, just because you've kept something on a website doesn't mean it's going to stay there. You literally need to archive it. And so we need to think about, do you need to run a concurrent archiving system such as Catalog It, where you can screenshot and grab and build a digital archive? Do you run that alongside modes? Because we all know modes isn't going to get replaced, right? And embed the Spectrum principles to it. What training is available to you to understand how to archive social media? We can't ignore that social media is here to stay, and it is the best, very often the best way of giving communities a way of expressing themselves using the collections. Building digital exhibitions is affordable. It also is funky and cool. They want to do it, particularly when you're working with young people, right? Instagram is free, etc. So we can't stop doing it. We on our end internally have to learn how to archive it. If modes can't archive it, which it can't, then we need to adopt systems that can. And there's training that needs to go into that, and there's funding that the staff need to give them access to that training and that the labor and time to do it.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Can I just add something in there, which is slightly aside, but the in the question it says about, you know, the engagement and how can it be captured into the project database, which EJ's responded to. But I think one of the things that we're all struggling with at the moment is the value of digital engagement, and how you evaluate that, how you assess it. And there is some work that's about to kick off with Manchester University and the Alan Turing Institute, looking into that. And I think that would be really useful for everyone when that comes out. I don't know kind of when it will be due out. I think it's going to take place over the next year. But because we've been working digitally for quite a long time, it's something that I would say not even we've answered properly yet. And we're involved in the project with the Alan Turing Institute. And I think that's a very good question that's been put out there about capturing it in the database as well.
Great, thank you very much. It's so true. We've all rushed. We all feel that we're all digitally more literate because of COVID. We've all rushed to it, but now is a good time maybe to pause and think about how effective and impactful we can be. We've got a few more questions. So this is to all of the speakers. What new things have you learned about your own collections from working with new people and partners? And how will this new information be captured in any formal documentation processes at your organizations? So why don't we start with Vicky?
Oh, I'm muting myself. Oh gosh, you just learn so much. You just learn how people perceive the world and perceive objects in such a different way to yourself. And it makes you reflect on your own interpretation and the own work that you have done in the past. I'm just going back to the question because there was a lot of that. You wanted to know how it had.
Just things that you've learned about your own collections that perhaps you hadn't anticipated from working with new people, communities and partners, and how you're capturing this information more formally
and sharing it. Well, from our point of view, I think where I've learned particularly is often working with people with varying forms of autism and their interpretation of objects being often very different to our own. And I think it's a really inspiring take on the world and your objects, and that's the joy of all the projects that everyone's presented today, who's been involved in that work. In terms of capturing it and sharing it, it is their interpretation that we are capturing and sharing, not our own. So it'll be out there. We're still at the early stages of our project compared to some of the presentations today. So I haven't been able to share the output as much with you, but it is their interpretation of the object that we're putting out there, not our own. It's very much a gallery about our participants' journey, about their involvement, their choice of objects, what those objects mean to them. And again, it depends on how they want to share that, and that sometimes depends on their disability. Some people might want to do an oral recording, some people might want to do some written text. So again, it's responding to how they want that shared as well.
Would any of the other speakers like to answer that question as well?
I'll chip in. I think, well, I mean, we've learned so much, but I think the value of people's lived experiences is just so deep and phenomenal. And I can read all the books in the world and never understand an object in the way that someone else can. And I think a really good example from us, and it's a really like one of these things that never happens in museums, which is why I love it. So we have one of the most internationally significant collections of material from Somalia. So worldwide, we're like compared to the Smithsonian, our little museum in Kent. And that includes a collection from a part of Somalia, the Bajuni Islands, that the population there, the Bajuni population, have been discriminated against by Somalis for like 200 years. And so when our collection was made in the 1930s, a lot of them had already fled to Kenya and other places. And then the Somali Civil War, not only were they being attacked for being Bajuni, but then the Civil War kind of displaced everyone as well. And we did some work with Kate McSweeney, in fact, who has already had a mention, on a project they did called Object Stories with the Somali community in London. And they borrowed a lot of our objects, but specifically photographs we had in the collection, and they put them online in this online exhibition. And in the middle of the lockdown, Kate got an email from a man in Kenya who is Bajuni saying, that photograph, that's my great-grandmother. So I immediately got in touch with him. I sent him all the other photographs on the page in that photo album. He shared them with his family WhatsApp group, and he started identifying all these other people. And it turns out that him and his uncle, who are one of the few elders in the community that sort of still has a physical link to the Bajuni Islands, are trying to make a genealogy of the Bajuni Islands. And here is a museum with a collection made in the mid-30s, so within living memory, of people that they recognized. And we've got all these photographs of all these people from this really tiny part of the world, of a community that is now scattered globally. And whatever it gives us, I sort of said, I don't really care what the museum gets out of it, actually, because it's much more important what this community can get out of it. So I've been just emailing him these photographs. I don't care who he shares them with, like, you know, they're going around the family WhatsApp group worldwide, and I'm not going to make him sign some disclaimer or fill in a thing about licensing agreement, like, who cares? But we're trying to organize a Zoom call, and we're feeding all that information back into the database. And so for us, giving context, one of our really big thing is we have thousands of photographs of unnamed people. And to be able to put names to those faces, and, you know, this was a person, this was someone's grandmother, this was a member of this community, and this is who they were, is an incomparably significant piece of information that we can add to the collection. And that's nothing I could ever bring to the collection, however many books I read. So I think, yeah, it's things like that, really.
It's interesting. I was jotting down just words as I listened to each of the speakers, and these are just ideas or words or themes that popped into a lot of what you were saying today. This need for flexibility and not making assumptions, or not sticking to your assumptions, and being willing to kind of throw out what maybe your original intentions were with a project. And that is true collaboration. And this is a real culture shift for museums, because I think, you know, we've been very driven by process and deadlines and timelines. And it's just the way that, you know, museums have evolved over the years, that, you know, we look for our funding, we set an exhibition start date, and we all work to those deadlines. And it just sounds like, you know, there is a culture shift. We need to start thinking and building in more flexibility and more capacity at the front end of the thinking around a project without being too prescriptive. How have you managed to do that? Because that's a really challenging thing to do within an organization, with your own teams, and also lobbying for that support from whoever senior in your organization makes those final decisions. How have you managed some of that culture change? And Philip, you're on my screen, so I'm going to put you on the spot.
Oh, hi. Well, it's interesting, because as curators, me and my colleagues, we only started a couple of years ago. It doesn't seem like that in a way, in 2019, and Damien, our boss, he'd already set the museum in the direction of a complete culture change. That being, it's in our job title, we're collections and engagement curators, so we're doing them both. So there's that, and also our desire to sort of be a community museum. So it was already sort of in there. So, I mean, I'm sort of used to doing a bit of both in collections management work and also engagement. So in a way, I can sort of see why I was employed there, because I was sort of happy doing both. So it's really just sort of continuing what Damien started. But yeah, I echo what the others have said about objects, people reacting in sort of different ways to objects, and the possibilities that objects bring. Because so one example is that there was sort of a tin of bird bones we had, and some of the participants were so interested in it, they went out and researched the guy that collected it, and so that added value to the object. And I think that added value is, you know, that can happen in such a multitude of ways, just by serendipity, by people having contact with objects and people being shown objects. And the example of the photograph I thought was great. And I think just getting our objects documented is the start of that. Knowing what we've got and sharing it with our communities is just a no-brainer, because they can contribute and help us learn more about our objects. And I'm hoping at some point I'll get a reply from somebody, or like the National Maritime Museum, about Mr. King's Venus flower baskets, because there's going to be a whole story behind them. So yeah, I think by engaging you get more from your objects.
And how about I'm going to put EJ on the spot. for those museums where maybe it's not the person at the top who has, where somebody lower down in the organization has to lobby for support from trustees or from decision makers to make these changes, to build in this capacity. Do you have any advice on how to start that journey?
I mean, I think community engagement is increasingly being at the top of the list, actually. I haven't found that it's taken a lot of lobbying to change minds. I've found more that it's a matter of showcasing that you've got a structure to the project that's manageable, and that it quantifies the staff time to be able to deliver it, and it's not over ambitious, and that it has clear outputs. That's what in fact, to big up Hastings Museum, that's what was so brilliant about their What's in the Box program, when with the LGBT project that I was lucky enough to be involved with. It was very well briefed for the community. You get one object, you know, this many meetings, this is going to be the output, and then we're going to put in one cabinet in the museum. So the structure and the way it was quantified with the progress as it went along also matched then the grant application, but the output and the way that it was delivered. And it worked like an absolute dream, because it wasn't over ambitious. It focused on certain object and tied up the entire job before the community left. It didn't leave a lag of a workload on the internal staff for them to have to pick up the pieces once the community had walked away. And I think really that structure is really important. And I think if you can also measure what the impact on the collection is going to be. So we are going to create 6 new tags, and it's going to be across 50 objects. And that's what this project does. Do you know what I mean? By actually putting some kind of measuring system on it, I think you have far more chance of persuading the staff that the community can help them in their job, not hinder them in their job. And that's really what I think we need to get better at. And potentially we may even see a shift on what a curator is. Certainly Philip's mentioned, you know, hinted at it already, the definition of the curator actually being, you know, part of their workload is engagement. Now I balk at the idea of giving curators any more work. You know, there's just not enough curators in the world, and there's not enough hours in the day to deal with the collections as it is. But in actual fact, I do think we're going to see these roles become more blended, and that job descriptions will change shape in the recruitment process moving forward, and that actually it's going to be organizational change that happens to support those roles developing like that. And that will be the, you know, one of the biggest impacts of the community on the museum will actually be that it creates systemic organizational change in the long term.
That's great.
Can I just add to that a little bit? I really agree with what EJ is saying. I think there is change afloat, but I think there's still quite a lot of museums out there, and I suspect that none of us as speakers are one of them, but there are still quite a few that have, you know, their governance structure is outdated. And I think that where we don't have to make those arguments is because we already have a type of governance, and at the centre of that governance are values in the way that we work and the way we outreach to our communities, which means that bringing together projects like that is not difficult for us arguing upwards. I might be wrong with the other presenters, but I do think that there's probably people listening here that it can be really hard for, and until that kind of governance is modernized and you kind of put some of those values at your heart, it can be harder to make your case.
And this feeds into a much bigger issue, doesn't it, about diversity on our board of trustees, on who represents the, who's there to represent these decisions being made in the first place. You put some members of the community on the boards and things change pretty quickly, right? So again, we see this at Brighton Museum, recruiting trustees that are from specific groups and representing specific groups. And they're doing it as a strategy to enable them to broaden their interpretation of collections and widen up the collections to wider audiences.
Exactly.
EJ, there's a question, just a follow-up question. Could you say how you've built in staff time and collections documentation time into grant applications? And do you have any tips for articulating the importance of this to funders?
I'm going to be completely honest, not very well. In actual fact, it's something that I want to concentrate on much more moving forward. I think that we all need sort of a little pat on the back here. We're talking about new museology here, right? We're talking about a new wave of how museums operate and reach out and care for their collections and talk about their collections. So in actual fact, I feel like my methodology is still in progress, but I don't have all the answers at all yet. I do, though, when it comes to thinking about how to build in staff time for the collections. It's something that we didn't get right with the Queer the Peer exhibition at Brighton Museum that involved 30 volunteers over 2 years to put on an exhibition that would run for 2 years in the Spotlight Gallery. In actual fact, the ripple out effect of the labour on the organisation wasn't well enough planned before the project kicked off. Right, it was too ambitious and didn't have enough structure in it. So in actual fact, what I think needs to happen next time round is that we actually write the grant cross-departmentally. So there are meetings to discuss the grant and what labour would be involved to produce the output we're aiming at, and then write that in from every department with a quantified, I need a day a week for 6 months if this is going to happen, right? And literally do it like that, so that that's part of the cost of the grant, and that potentially you're asking for the grant to pay for an extra day a week if the organisation can't afford to spare that labour. Right? So it means that you're building it on top of instead of taking away from. And then that goes into the actual grant application. I need, 60 days work from this department, essentially. So I think actually really going, here's the output we want, and working backwards from there when you're grant writing, as opposed to grant writing forward to the output, so that you're quantifying right back to the starting point, down to, we're going to look at this many objects, we're going to do this many tags, we're going to do this many database entries, we're going to have 10 community meetings, and it's going to run over 6 months, and it's going to take a day of all of these people's time per output. So I think it's about seeing progress as product, not just an exhibition at the end as the product. It's measuring progress as valuable and as an output unto itself.
Very helpful. I'm going to ask, we're coming to the end of our time together. So I thought what I would do is go to each speaker and just ask for a tip, for a museum who's keen on developing their collections and maybe stepping out of a comfort zone. So if we go in the order of the speakers, that's probably the easiest way to do it. So Vicky, if you have a top tip or a couple of tips for our audience.
I think my top tip is slightly related to what EJ was just saying, which is also, when you do an application or you're running a project, don't berate yourself when it doesn't go to all of those predictive things that your funders want you to put in. And actually just focus on all the unexpected, you know, put a bit of focus on the unexpected things that happen. Because whenever however hard and however well you plan things out, there will always be changes to that plan, sometimes quite significant. And but there will also be bonuses that you hadn't planned for, which is really joyous and, you know, worth celebrating.
Great, thank you. Inbal?
I think my tip, right, so this is going to fly in the face of everything I've said about kind of going with the flow and seeing what happens. So make a plan. One of the things, so the reimagining program that we're running at the moment, I think we have 8 different projects going on, not just collections, sort of across the site. We have written a project charter for every single one of those. Now, that could be one side of A4 for one of the really small projects. The project charter for Colonial Critters is quite extensive. We go back to those every quarter and just sort of see where we are. We have change management document. Again, it's just like a Word document where we just kind of explain why we've made the changes we've made so that we can understand our process, so that, you know, if I suddenly get hit by a bus, someone else can come in and go, ah, that's why that project ended up kind of following that path. But it also holds us accountable, because every 6 months we go back and we go, okay, this is where we said we'd be, this is what we said we'd be doing. Is that still our focus? Have we kind of gone a bit off piste? And we do that for every single project, no matter the size. And they're all written in different styles because they're all written by the person who's the project lead, and all of our team have different styles of working and different styles of learning, but they're all held in a central location where everyone can look at them. And then our senior management team, of which I'm a part, and our CEO and our director, and, you know, our trustees, if they're interested, which actually they are, which is really helpful, because sort of have access to these quick understanding of what this project is, what it's trying to achieve. And, you know, we've already had 2 instances where we've had to go back to them and say, okay, we're going to have to delay this because COVID has put a stop to this, or we're going to need more money for this, but we're cutting money from that. So do you approve for us to kind of make that change? And because they've got it all laid out in front of them, it's much easier to get their sort of approval very quickly without having much of a discussion about it. So yeah, plan, but also be flexible.
And document change.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Then we have EJ.
If you're an accredited museum or working towards accreditation, you're going to have a forward plan. It'll be a 3-year forward plan or a 5-year forward plan. Read it, right? Read it and find out where the holes are in it for engaging communities and embedding that within the structure of the museum. And then once you've read it and you can spot those holes, write yourself a blended model for delivery. We don't need to throw digital out now that museums are back open. There's some things that digital does very well. For example, it enables people to not have to travel to the museum every time there's a community meeting, which means they may be able to spare an hour on a Wednesday night, but if they're a single mum, they otherwise couldn't have, right? So write a blended model that acknowledges that digital does offer, particularly when it comes to accessibility, opportunities for people to engage with the museum in ways that wouldn't have been open to them before, and then deliver on the back of the digital object engagement and visits to the museum. So you're going to cut down on staff labor by using the digital model, but you're going to then bring the volunteers in for the magic of the museum and make it a friendlier place that they feel more a part of anyway, because you've built up a relationship. And this goes back to what I was saying about we need to go out into communities as much as we need communities to come to us, and digital is one way of doing that. And so if you build that relationship within 3 digital meetings, those volunteers are going to be dying to come to the museum. They are going to be dying to meet each other in real life, and they're going to be dying to have a beer at the pub afterwards all together, right? So it actually builds momentum for the depth of engagement that you will get, and it builds excitement, and it enamors people with the opportunity of being at the museum. And sometimes that really helps for the community members who aren't familiar with the pressures we have on us, with the internal pressures that we suffer, particularly with funding and staff availability. Sometimes it makes them appreciate that more once they're there, that actually this is an opportunity and that it is very special and that lots of people have been involved in making it happen. And so it makes them value that engagement more deeply as well. So putting that blended model of engagement into the forward plan so that it can't be ignored, I think is a strategic move that can really help you embed the commitment of the organisation to this process. And as you were saying, Vicky, not allow the trustees to brush it off, for example, right? Because the commitment is there in ink on paper.
Philip and then Jasmine.
Right, probably sort of lots of little things really. I work part-time at Hastings Museum. We quite often timing is pressure because we're only 2.5 days a week. But we'd won funding to buy in extra time, so that goes back to what EJ was saying about factoring in staff time into projects. So what I do to sort of try and keep on top of things is I have a to-do list. That's the obvious one. But I ask for help, so probably sometimes much to the annoyance of colleagues. But asking for help. Over the pandemic, we had front of house staff who didn't have much to do, so we got them involved in various things. It could have been just cleaning, lots of cleaning around the museum, or helping us to rename photographs of objects or what have you. And try and dovetail things together. And quite often, you have a project and think about what else is going on and how things can work together. That can work quite well. It worked quite well during What's in the Box. There are all these collections challenges and dealing with those whilst also working with the families worked much better than I expected. So that's really sort of turning problems into opportunities, which is, I think, the sort of number one for most curators of collections. You're constantly bombarded with these problems, be that a pest infestation or a malfunctioning environmental control or monitoring system, and you're finding a way to solve the problem. Quite often it's by trying to apply for funding, but in all problems there are opportunities.
And I suppose by asking for help from colleagues, they're buying into what you're doing. They
absolutely, yeah.
So
it's not always easy because colleagues, they'll have time pressures as well. But quite often you can sort of help them with something as well. Finding allies, not just in your workplace, but also outside of the workplace. So, trying to get advocacy for your work in the museum, obviously shouldn't just be internal. You need the people from the outside telling you and telling the wider sector about the good work you're doing and how it's important. So yeah, evaluation. That's why evaluation is really important, because otherwise, we're just asking for money for our own jobs.
And finally, Jasmine, any top tips from you?
Yeah, so as an outsider looking in at museums, I'd say that over the last year, to me, it seems like there's already been quite a lot of change. But I would just say that, don't be frightened about using, problematic objects within your collection. There's a lot of, we've had a lot of social unrest, lots of different discussions happening over the last year. And I feel like for young people, especially in a lot of these projects that you've all been talking about today, giving them a voice and using the museum as, a safe space to talk about these difficulties is a really powerful thing for them, and I think will really change the future of your museums. As someone that's worked in museums for 15 years, I've really seen a change from, as you've all been talking about, it's almost like the museum's dictating to the audience. A lot of younger people are not interested in these museums, but if you can become kind of a platform for radical kind of change, that's really exciting. And, you know, I come obviously more from natural history specialism, and natural history has a lot of problematic things behind it. So for me, if you have any natural history objects in your collection, you know, rather than being frightened about talking about the fact that they've been killed, you know, and things like that, actually, you know, bring it right forward, say, you know, honestly, this is where this object's come from, you know, and this is how important that object still is. This is why we shouldn't throw it away, why we should still care for it. And these are, you know, the things we can do with these objects now, and how taxidermy is still relevant, basically, is kind of, you know, what I'm saying. But really put, you know, be honest about, you know, the problems that collections hold. That'd be my advice. But I think you're all doing it already, so it's great.
Well, that's going to wrap things up right now. And I just want to say, I mean, I really enjoyed the session. I hope everyone else did. Thank you very much to our speakers for preparing, for doing, first of all, for doing all this amazing work, but then taking the time. I know it was a big commitment of time to come here this morning and share that with us. I also want to send a thank you to Helen Derbyshire, who's my colleague who arranged and coordinated the whole session today. So there's a lot of good work and a lot of thought that went into the project. A reminder for our participants that today marks the launch of a small grants program called Creative Collections that we're running up to £3,000 to initiate or do a project to support the development of your collections. And you know, this is also extended to our speakers as well, because I know you're on an ongoing journey with your collections. But we're here to help, you know, and we're here to help museums take those risks. And we know that there's always a financial, you know, risk that's involved. So hopefully we'll start off with a pilot program this year with our grants and build on that in the coming years. So hopefully this is a program, Creative Collections, that will unroll and over the next few